name is Paul, and for 3 years I worked the night shift at a gas station on a desolate highway in Nevada. What I'm about to tell you changed my perception of people forever and made me realize that real monsters don't just appear in horror movies. But I'll start from the beginning, because to understand what happened, you need to know about my job and how I ended up there. I was 24 years old when I got the job at the Shell station on Route 50, about 40 kilometers east of Fallon. It wasn't exactly my dream job, but after losing my job at a factory in Las Vegas and burning through my savings trying to stay afloat, any job that paid the bills was welcome. The station was located in what locals called the middle of nowhere, a barren stretch of desert where the highway stretched straight to the horizon in both directions. During the day, there was regular traffic, truckers, tourists heading to Lake Tahoe, locals. But at night, especially between 2 and 6 in the morning, the place became a lonely oasis of fluorescent light in the midst of absolute darkness. My shift was from 10 at night to 6 in the morning, 6 days a week. The job was simple: work the register, keep the place clean, restock merchandise, and basically make sure no one stole gas or trashed the place. The manager, a guy named Rick, who had run gas stations for 30 years, warned me that nights could be weird at that location. "You'll see all kinds of strange people at night," he told me on my first day. "Druggies, fugitives, people who just don't want to be seen during the day. Keep your head down, don't ask questions, and if something feels off, press the panic button under the counter." In my first few weeks, I understood what he meant. The nighttime customers were definitely different. There were truckers who had clearly been driving longer than allowed, with bloodshot eyes and trembling hands as they paid for coffee and caffeine pills. There were young women who seemed to be running from something, buying only the essentials and constantly looking toward the highway as if expecting someone to follow them. There were men in expensive cars who paid in cash and never made eye contact. I quickly learned not to ask questions. My job was to sell gas and snacks, not to play psychologist or detective. It was during my second month when I started noticing the pattern. 3 men always arrived between 3:15 and 3:30 in the morning, usually on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Always in the same vehicle, a dark blue Ford F-150 pickup, mid-2000s model, with Nevada plates that I could never fully read because they were always caked in mud. The 3 men were distinctive in different ways. The driver was tall and lean, probably about 35 years old, with very short blonde hair and a scar running across his left cheek. He always wore blue work shirts, the kind mechanics or construction workers wear. The one in the passenger seat was shorter and stockier, with a thick dark beard and tattoos covering both forearms. I could never see the designs clearly, but they seemed to be tribal or military. He had the cautious movements of an ex-convict, always assessing the exits, never fully turning his back on anyone. The third, who always sat in the back, was the youngest, maybe in his early 20s. He had long black hair down to his shoulders and a nervous way of constantly looking around, as if expecting something bad to happen at any moment. Their routine was always exactly the same. The driver came in alone, bought exactly $30 worth of gas, 2 packs of Marlboro Red, 6 cans of Red Bull, and a large bag of beef jerky. He always paid in cash, never large bills, just $5, $10, and $20 bills, as if he'd been hoarding loose change. While the driver made the purchases, the other 2 stayed in the pickup. The one in the middle always had a map spread out on his lap, though he never seemed to actually study it. It felt more like he was using the map as an excuse to keep his head down and avoid the security cameras. The young guy in the back seat was never still. He constantly looked out the windows, checked the rearview mirrors, shifted from side to side as if anxious to leave. At first, I thought they might be construction workers with an early job somewhere remote. Nevada is full of mining projects, government facilities, and construction sites in isolated areas that require people to work odd hours. But as the weeks went by, I started noticing details that didn't fit that theory. First, their truck never showed the kind of wear you'd expect from construction workers. There were no visible tools, no safety equipment, no dust or grime that builds up when you work on desert construction sites. Second, their schedule was too inconsistent for regular workers. Sometimes they came on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Other weeks I'd see them on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Occasionally, they'd show up 4 or 5 days in a row, then disappear for a full week. Third, and this was what really started to unsettle me, they never seemed tired. Real night workers have a certain look, tired eyes, slow movements, that slightly zombie-like manner you develop when your sleep schedule is completely messed up. These guys always seemed alert, energized, as if they'd slept perfectly and were in the middle of something exciting. After about 2 months of seeing this pattern, I started paying closer attention to them specifically. Not in an obvious way. I'd learned to be discreet with nighttime customers, but I began making mental notes of small details every time they came in. The driver always walked in with the same quiet confidence. He never seemed rushed, but he didn't waste time either. He knew exactly what he wanted, went straight to get it, and completed the transaction efficiently. He never made small talk beyond, "How you doing tonight?" and "Thanks, have a good one." But there was something in his eyes that made me nervous. They weren't aggressive or threatening, but there was a coldness there, a lack of normal human warmth that made me feel like I was being evaluated every time he looked at me. One night in early November, while the driver was picking up his usual items, I noticed what looked like fresh scratches on the back of his hands, red lines that seemed to have been made by human fingernails. "Work accident," he said, when he noticed me looking, though I hadn't asked anything. "Oh, yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "What do you guys do, if you don't mind me asking?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Cleaning. We work for an industrial cleaning company. Lots of different jobs, lots of weird hours." It was a perfectly reasonable answer, but something in his tone made me feel like he was lying to me. That same night, after they left, I called my girlfriend Sarah to tell her about the interaction. Sarah worked as a dispatcher for the Churchill County Sheriff, so she had developed good instincts about suspicious people. "Scratches on his hands?" she asked. "Like from a fight?" "That's what I thought. But they could have been from anything. Paul, be careful with those guys. If something feels off, trust your instincts." I promised her I would, but part of me thought I might be paranoid. After all, working alone at a gas station in the middle of the desert at night can make you imagine things. But the next encounters with the 3 men only increased my discomfort. The next time they came, I noticed that the guy in the back seat had what looked like a partially healed black eye. When he realized I was looking at him through the window, he immediately looked away and sank deeper into the seat. The time after that, the bearded guy in the passenger seat had bandages on his knuckles, like he'd punched something hard. Individually, these things could have been coincidences, but the pattern was starting to become hard to ignore. I decided to start documenting their visits. Nothing formal, just notes on my phone about when they came, what they bought, and any odd details I noticed. I wasn't sure what I planned to do with the information, but I felt it was important to keep a record just in case. My notes from November 23rd, 3:22 in the morning, Three usual guys. Driver brought the usual. They seemed more nervous than normal. The guy in the back kept looking toward the highway, like someone was following them. They left quickly. My notes from November 26th. 3:18 in the morning. Only the driver and the bearded guy came. The young one wasn't with them. Driver asked if we sold alcohol. We don't. Seemed irritated when I said no. My notes from November 30th. 3:25 in the morning. All three back. The young guy had what looked like a cut on his neck, like someone had tried to strangle him. When he saw me looking, he pulled up his shirt to cover it. It was after that last entry that I decided I had to do something about my suspicions. The problem was that I had no real evidence of anything criminal. Men with minor injuries buying gas wasn't exactly grounds to call the police. But Sarah had contacts at the sheriff's office who might be interested in information about suspicious activity in the area, especially if there was a pattern. "Do you have the plates on their truck?" Sarah asked when I told her about my most recent observations. I could never see them clearly. They're always covered in mud. That in itself is suspicious. In the Nevada desert, there's not that much mud to cover plates unless you're doing it on purpose. Sarah spoke with one of the detectives she dispatched for, a guy named Martinez who had worked on drug and organized crime cases. Martinez was interested but cautious. "Tell your boyfriend to keep his eyes open," Martinez told Sarah, "but don't let him try to be a hero. If these guys are involved in something serious, you don't want them realizing he's watching them." Martinez's advice turned out to be prophetic. Over the next 2 weeks, the three men's visits became more frequent but less predictable. Sometimes they came 2 nights in a row, then disappeared for 4 days. Sometimes they arrived at 2 in the morning. Other times, they didn't show up until 4:30. Their purchases also started to change. Instead of their usual routine, they began buying odd things: large rolls of duct tape, industrial trash bags, hand sanitizer, paper towels, things that could have perfectly innocent uses, but together created an unsettling pattern. The night of December 12th was when things got really strange. The three men arrived at 3:40 in the morning, later than usual. But this time, something was different about their demeanor. They seemed celebratory, not loud or obvious about it, but there was a positive energy among them that I hadn't seen before. The driver came in as usual, but this time his movements had a kind of satisfaction to them, like he'd just completed a successful project. "Good night," he said to me, with a smile that seemed genuine for the first time. "Yeah, pretty quiet," I replied. "I imagine the nights can be lonely out here." "Sometimes." He grabbed his usual purchases, but added something new: a large bottle of shampoo and a pack of disposable razors. "Planning to clean up for the holidays?" I tried to joke. His smile cooled slightly. "Something like that." When he went to pay, I noticed something that made me feel like I'd been punched in the stomach. In his wallet, just for a second while he pulled out cash, I saw a driver's license that definitely wasn't his. It was for a young woman, blonde, with a bright smile. I tried to act normal as I completed the transaction, but my mind was racing. Why would he have someone else's driver's license? Could it be his wife or girlfriend? But why would he carry it in his wallet alongside his own ID? After they left that night, I stayed awake for the rest of my shift, trying to decide what to do. When I got home, I searched online for any news about missing women in the Nevada area over the past few weeks. What I found made me call Sarah immediately. Jessica Morrison, 23 years old, had disappeared from a casino in Reno 2 weeks earlier. Her car had been found in the parking lot, but there was no trace of her. The description matched the woman whose license I'd seen. blonde, young, bright smile. Sarah, I think these guys are involved in something serious. Something really bad. Sarah could hear the panic in my voice. What did you see exactly? I told her about the driver's license. Sarah went silent for a long moment. Paul, you need to call Martinez directly. Right now, Detective Martinez asked me to come to the sheriff's station that same afternoon. It was the first time I'd been in a police station, and the serious atmosphere of the place made everything feel more real and terrifying. Martinez was an older man, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and a calm but intense way of asking questions. He asked me to tell him everything from the beginning, leaving out no detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. I told him about the pattern of their visits, about the injuries I'd noticed, about the changes in their purchases, and finally about the driver's license I'd seen. Are you sure it was the same woman? He asked, showing me an official photo of Jessica Morrison. Pretty sure. I only saw it for a second, but the hair, the face, it looked very similar. Martinez nodded. Paul, I'm going to be straight with you. We've been investigating a series of disappearances in the area for the past 6 months. All young women, all missing under similar circumstances. If these guys are involved, then you're in a unique position to help us stop them. What do you need me to do? For now, nothing different. Keep working your normal shift. Keep observing, but don't do anything that might make them suspect you're paying special attention. We're going to install additional surveillance equipment at your station, and we'll have undercover officers in the area during your shifts. And if they figure out I'm watching them, Martinez looked at me seriously. That's why we'll have protection nearby. But Paul, if you ever feel like you're in immediate danger, use the panic button and get out of the building. Don't try to be a hero. The next few days were the most stressful of my life. Every unusual noise made me jump. Every customer I didn't recognize made me wonder if they might be connected to the 3 men. Every time I saw headlights approaching on the highway in the early morning hours, my heart raced. Martinez had been true to his word about the additional surveillance. Though I couldn't see them, I knew there were officers positioned around the station. They'd also installed additional cameras with better resolution, including one that had a clear view of the area where the 3 men always parked. The next time the 3 men showed up was December 18th. This time, I was ready for them. They arrived at 3:15 in the morning, exactly as they had dozens of times before. But this time, I paid attention to details I'd never noticed before, because I now knew they were important. The pickup had new dents on the passenger side, as if someone had been pounding the metal from the inside. There were what looked like scratches in the paint near the door handles, and when the driver got out of the truck, I noticed he had what looked like dried blood under his fingernails. But the most unsettling thing was the smell. When the driver walked into the store, he brought with him an odor I recognized, but couldn't immediately place. It was sweet and unpleasant at the same time, like rotting fruit mixed with something chemical. Only later did I realize it was the smell of decomposition. The driver stuck to his usual routine, but there was a subtle difference in his behavior. He seemed more relaxed than in recent visits, but also more cautious. His eyes were constantly moving, scanning the store, watching the windows, checking reflections on glass surfaces to see if anyone was watching him. "How's business been lately?" he asked me as he gathered his purchases. "Good, I guess. Nights are quiet. I imagine you see all kinds of interesting people at night." There was something in his tone that made me feel like I was being tested. "Not really. Most nighttime people just want to buy gas and go smart." His smile was cold. "It's better to keep your head down mind your own business. The message was clear. He knew I'd been watching them, and he was warning me to stop. After they left that night, I called Martinez immediately. He definitely knows something, I reported to him. The way he talked, the questions he asked. He's warning me. Okay, Paul. He's probably just being cautious, but stay alert. If they ever don't show up when you expect them, or if their behavior changes drastically, call me immediately. I didn't have to wait long. The 3 men didn't show up for their next scheduled visit on December 21st, nor did they on the 23rd, or the 26th. At first, I thought maybe they'd changed their schedule again, or decided to get gas somewhere else. But as the days passed with no sign of them, I started to get a bad feeling. Maybe they noticed the surveillance, Martinez suggested when I reported their absence. Or maybe they just moved to another area. But I knew something else was going on. I'd seen the way the driver had looked at me during his last visit. It wasn't just caution, it was assessment. Like he was deciding what to do with me. The morning of December 28th, Sarah called me at work during my shift. Paul, you need to listen to the news. They just found something. I turned on the station's radio and heard the report that would change everything. 3 bodies had been found in an abandoned house about 60 kilometers north of my gas station. 2 men and a woman, all dead from gunshot wounds. The police believed they had been dead for at least a week. But what made my blood run cold was the description of the 2 men. One tall and lean, with a scar on his cheek. The other short and stocky, with a thick beard and tattoos on his forearms. They were 2 of my 3 regular nighttime visitors. The woman found with them was later identified as Jessica Morrison, the young woman whose driver's license I'd seen in the driver's wallet. The 3rd man, the nervous young guy who always sat in the back seat, was not among the bodies found. Martinez called me a few hours after the news broke. Paul, I need you to come to the station immediately. There are developments in the case you need to know about. At the sheriff's station, Martinez explained what they'd discovered. The 2 dead men had been identified as brothers, Robert and Michael Kemp, both with records for kidnapping and assault. The investigation of the house where they were found had revealed evidence of multiple victims over several months. We believe Jessica Morrison wasn't their only victim, Martinez told me. We found personal belongings from at least 6 different women in that house. Driver's licenses, jewelry, clothing, all hidden like trophies. And the 3rd man? Derek Vasquez, 23 years old. He's got a juvenile record, but nothing serious as an adult. We think he might have been coerced into participating, maybe under threat. But here's the thing, Paul. Vasquez has completely disappeared. His apartment was abandoned over a week ago. His car was found burned out in the desert. Do you think he's dead too? Martinez shrugged. We don't know. He could be dead. He could be on the run. Or... He paused, as if considering whether to tell me more. Or what? Or he might have been the one who killed the other 2. That possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. Derek had been the most nervous of the group, the one who seemed most uncomfortable with what they were doing. Maybe he'd finally had enough and decided to end it all. Am I in danger? I asked Martinez. We don't think so. If Derek killed the other 2, it was probably because he wanted out of the situation. There's no reason for him to come after you. But we're going to keep extra patrols in your area for a while, just to be safe. Over the next few weeks, I tried to return to normal at my job, but it wasn't easy. Every time a car pulled up in the early morning hours, I expected to see the familiar blue pickup. Every customer I didn't recognize made me wonder if it could be Derek Vasquez seeking revenge for ruining their operation. But the weeks turned into months, and there was never any sign of him. Gradually, I started to relax and believe it was truly over. It was in April, almost 4 months after the last time I'd seen the 3 men, when I found the note. I was doing my usual cleaning rounds around 4 in the morning when I noticed someone had taped a piece of paper to the inside of one of the store's windows, where it wouldn't be visible from outside, but where I would inevitably see it. The note was simple, handwritten in block letters. Paul, thanks, D. I called Martinez immediately. He arrived at the station in less than 30 minutes with a team of forensic technicians to process the note. How long could it have been there? He asked me as the techs photographed and collected evidence. I don't know. I clean the windows every night, but maybe not as thoroughly as I should. It could have been there for days, or it might have been placed tonight. Have you noticed any unfamiliar cars in the area? Anyone acting suspiciously? No, nothing out of the ordinary. Martinez studied the note again. The word thanks suggests Derek thinks you did something that helped him. Maybe reporting to us gave him the excuse he needed to end what they were doing. But why leave a note? Why risk coming back here? Who knows? Maybe he wanted closure. Maybe he wanted you to know you're not a threat to him. Or maybe, I thought, but didn't say, he wanted me to know he was still out there, that he still knew where to find me if he ever decided I was a threat after all. That note was the last I ever heard of Derek Vasquez or the whole situation. Martinez kept me updated for a few more months, but the investigation eventually went cold. Derek was never found, alive or dead. It became another one of those unsolved cases that occasionally pop up in local news on anniversaries, but gradually fade from public memory. I quit working at the gas station 6 months later. Officially, it was because I'd found a better job at an office in Reno, but the truth was I couldn't handle the lonely nights anymore. Every shift had become an anxiety-ridden experience, waiting for the next person to walk through the door to be someone from my past, coming to settle unfinished business. Now I work a normal day job with normal hours and normal colleagues, but I still think about those 3 men almost every day. I think about the victims they kidnapped and murdered. I think about Derek Vasquez, wherever he is now, and I think about that note. Thanks, D. Was he really thanking me for helping him escape a situation that had spiraled out of control? Or was there something more sinister in that message? I'll never know. And maybe that's for the best. What I do know is that my experience taught me that true evil rarely looks evil from the outside. Those 3 men looked like ordinary workers running nighttime errands. Nothing about their appearance or behavior screamed kidnappers or murderers. They were just regular guys buying gas and snacks like anyone else, but beneath that normality was something monstrous. And if I hadn't paid attention to the small details, the unexplained injuries, the strange purchases, the wrong driver's license, it might never have been caught. I wonder how many other people are out there who seem completely normal on the surface, but are hiding terrible secrets. How many times we interact with monsters without realizing it. It's a thought that haunts me, especially on nights when I can't sleep and find myself remembering those months at the gas station, remembering the driver's cold smile, the nervous way Derek constantly looked around, the strange smells and unexplained injuries, and remembering that for a while, without knowing it, I was part of their routine. 3 times a week, after doing God knows what to their victims, they came to my gas station like it was the most normal thing in the world. The men disappeared, and I never heard from them again. But the memory of those encounters, the realization of how close I was to evil, without recognizing it, that will never go away. My name is Raul, and for 5 years I worked as a nighttime security guard at a chemical plant on the outskirts of Houston, Texas. Before I begin, I want to make it clear that this isn't one of those terrifying stories you've probably heard elsewhere on this channel. There are no ghosts, no monsters, nothing supernatural. But sometimes, reality can be more unsettling than any horror tale, especially when you realize that some people are capable of things you never imagined. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago, and to this day, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't decided to do that extra round one October night. But I'll start from the beginning, because to understand why what I discovered disturbed me so much, you need to know about my job and the place where I worked. Chemtech Industries was a medium-sized plant specializing in the production of industrial and pharmaceutical chemicals. Nothing too exotic or dangerous, mostly solvents, basic acids for processing, and some compounds for larger pharmaceutical companies. The plant operated 24 hours a day with 3 shifts of workers, but nighttime activity was minimal compared to the day. My shift was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 6 days a week. The job was fairly routine. Make rounds of the plant every 2 hours, monitor the security cameras, log anyone entering or leaving outside normal hours, and basically ensure nothing strange happened during the quieter hours. The plant had 4 main buildings: the administrative building, where my security office was, the main production building, where most of the work happened during the day, the quality control laboratory, and the materials warehouse. There were also several smaller structures for specialized storage and a waste treatment plant. During my first few years there, the job was exactly what I expected: quiet, predictable, occasionally boring. The night shift workers were a small, consistent group of about 10 people I knew well. The night supervisor, Tom Bradley, had been there for 15 years and ran his team with military efficiency. The night employees were mostly hardworking and reliable. There were some technicians who monitored automated processes, a couple of machine operators, and a few maintenance workers who took advantage of the quieter hours to do repairs and cleaning. Among them was Francis Kyler. Francis had started working at Chemtech about 8 months before the events I'm going to tell you about. He was a junior chemical technician, probably around 30 years old, with a college degree in chemistry, but not much work experience. He'd been unemployed for a while before landing the job at Chemtech, according to Tom. From the start, Francis was different from the rest of the night crew, not in an obvious or problematic way, but in subtle ways you only notice when you've worked with the same group of people for years. First, he was unusually quiet. Night shift workers tend to develop a sense of camaraderie because they're there during the odd hours when the rest of the world is asleep. There are usually jokes, conversations during breaks, that familiarity that comes from sharing tough shifts. Francis never really joined in. He was polite, professional, but kept his distance. Second, he seemed genuinely fascinated by aspects of the job that most people found routine. While other technicians did their monitoring tasks on autopilot, Francis always seemed to be studying the processes, asking questions about why things were done a certain way, what would happen if variables were changed. Tom once commented that Francis asked more questions in a month than most technicians did in a year. "He's curious," Tom had said, "which is good, I guess. But sometimes it feels like he's trying to learn more than he needs for his job." Third, and this was something only I really noticed because of my position, Francis had a habit of lingering after his shift. Not officially. He always clocked out at 6 a.m., as he was supposed to, but I often saw him on the security cameras leaving the main building, and then, instead of heading straight to the parking lot, wandering around the complex as if he were inspecting something. When I asked him about it once, he said he liked to walk a bit before driving home. "Helps me decompress after the shift," he explained. It was a perfectly reasonable answer, but something about the way he said it made me feel he wasn't being entirely honest. During my 6 a.m. rounds, I occasionally found evidence that Francis had been in areas where he had no reason to be. A door that should have been locked but was slightly ajar. Lights on in labs that should have been off. Small things that, individually, meant nothing but together formed a pattern. However, it was never anything concrete enough to report. Francis was a competent employee who did his job well and never caused obvious problems. My vague suspicions about his after-hours behavior weren't enough to justify a formal complaint. Everything changed on the night of October 15th. It was a typical Tuesday, quiet, even by night shift standards. The night crew had been working on a routine batch of industrial solvent, nothing complex or requiring special oversight. At 6 a.m., everyone had clocked out as usual. I did my final morning round, checking that everything was secure before the day shift arrived. It was during this round that I noticed Francis's car was still in the parking lot. At first, I thought maybe he'd had car trouble or someone had picked him up. But when I checked the entry and exit logs, Francis had clocked out at 6 and 3 a.m., along with everyone else. This was odd. Our policy was clear. Once you clocked out, you were supposed to leave the complex. Staying after clocking out was a security violation and could result in termination. I decided to investigate. First, I checked the security cameras to see if I could spot Francis anywhere in the complex. The system covered most of the main areas, though there were some blind spots in less critical hallways and storage areas. I couldn't see him on any of the live cameras, but that didn't necessarily mean he wasn't there. There were enough unmonitored areas where someone could hide if they knew the system's layout. I decided to do a more thorough search of the complex before the day shift arrived at 7 a.m. I started with the main production building, systematically checking each lab, office, and storage space. Most areas were locked, but I had security access to all doors. It was in the quality control laboratory where I found the first evidence that someone had been there recently. The lab was technically closed during nighttime hours. Quality control work was mostly done during the day shift when more oversight was available. But when I entered, I immediately noticed something was off. Equipment had been moved from its usual positions. Nothing dramatic, but lab technicians are creatures of habit and tend to leave everything exactly where it belongs. A centrifuge had been slightly rotated. A microscope had been moved to a different table. Small vials of reagents were in the wrong order on their shelf. More significantly, there were chemical residues on one of the workbenches that shouldn't have been there, stains that looked like diluted nitric acid and traces of a white powder I couldn't immediately identify. Francis had authorized access to the quality control lab as part of his normal duties, but he had no reason to be there outside his working hours, especially not doing what appeared to be unauthorized experimental work. I continued my search, now with a much sharper sense that something was definitely wrong. The next place I checked was the chemical materials warehouse. This was a separate building with higher security levels due to the nature of what was stored there. In addition to the relatively benign chemicals Chemtech used in its regular processes, we also stored limited quantities of more hazardous chemicals for specialized clients. The warehouse had its own card access entry system, and it kept automatic logs of who entered and when. When I checked the logs from the previous night, I found something that hit me like a punch to the gut. Francis had entered the warehouse at 3:47 a.m. According to the log, he never exited. That meant Francis had been in the chemical materials warehouse for over 3 hours, long after he'd clocked out of the complex. With my heart racing, I used my security access card to enter the warehouse. The first thing I noticed was that the main lights were off, but there was a flashlight on in one of the back sections of the warehouse. Someone was definitely there. I moved cautiously toward the light, trying to be as quiet as possible. I didn't know what I expected to find, but every instinct told me to be careful. What I saw when I reached the source of the light left me completely stunned. Francis was standing by one of the specialized storage racks, using the flashlight to illuminate several chemical containers he had pulled from their designated spots. He had a large backpack at his feet and was systematically transferring small amounts of various chemicals into smaller containers, which he then placed in the backpack. These weren't random chemicals. I recognized some of the containers: concentrated sulfuric acid, ammonium nitrate, high concentration hydrogen peroxide, and several other chemicals that, while having legitimate industrial uses, could also be used for much more sinister purposes. Francis hadn't seen me yet. He was completely focused on his work, moving with careful precision as if he'd done this before. The way he handled the chemicals suggested he knew exactly what he was doing and why. For a horrible moment, I was frozen. What should I do? Confront him directly? Call the police? Report it to management? The decision was made for me when I accidentally knocked over a box with my foot, making a noise that echoed in the silent warehouse. Francis froze, then turned slowly toward where I was standing. The beam of his flashlight temporarily blinded me, but I could see the expression on his face when he realized he'd been caught. It wasn't panic. It wasn't surprise. It was resignation, as if he'd been expecting this moment and had made peace with it. "Hey, Raoul," he said quietly. I guess it was only a matter of time. "Francis, what the hell are you doing?" He looked at the chemicals in his backpack, then back at me. "It's probably not what you think." "Really?" "Because it looks like you're stealing dangerous chemicals from the company." "Technically, I suppose I am." His voice was calm, almost conversational. "But it's not for what you probably think." "Then what's it for?" Francis was silent for a long moment, as if debating how much to tell me. "Have you ever heard of homemade chemotherapy, Raoul?" The question completely threw me off. "What?" "My sister has cancer. Stage 4. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do, that she only has a few months left. But I've been researching, reading studies, and there are experimental treatments that could help. Treatments hospitals don't offer because they're too experimental or too expensive." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "The chemicals I'm taking," Francis continued, "can be used to synthesize some of these experimental compounds. Nothing explosive, nothing that's going to hurt anyone. Just drugs that might give my sister a chance." It sounded plausible, even noble in a twisted way, but something about his explanation didn't feel entirely right. "Francis, even if that's true, you can't just steal chemicals from the company. And you definitely can't be making homemade chemotherapy. That's incredibly dangerous. I know." His voice cracked slightly. "I know it sounds crazy. I know it's illegal. But I don't have options, Raoul. Insurance doesn't cover experimental treatments. I don't have money for private clinics. This is her only shot." I wanted to believe him. The story was human enough, desperate enough to be true, but I'd spent enough time working security to develop instincts about when someone wasn't being completely honest. "Where's your sister getting these treatments?" I asked. Francis hesitated. At home. I have enough training to administer the right doses, and are doctors aware of this? Another hesitation. Not exactly. It was in those hesitations that my doubts grew stronger. If he was really trying to save his sister, why hadn't he gone to medical authorities? Why hadn't he sought help from cancer charities? Why all the secrecy? Francis, I need you to come with me to the security office. We have to report this. Raoul, please. For the first time, there was real panic in his voice. If you report this, my sister's going to die. If I don't report it, we're both going to be in much bigger trouble. Francis looked around the warehouse as if considering running, but there was only one exit, and I was standing between him and the door. Okay, he said finally, but could we keep this between us until I finish my last batch? I just need 1 more week. I can't do that, Francis. Just think about it. 1 week. After that, I'll resign, leave quietly, and you'll never have to see me again. The offer was tempting in a way. It would avoid a lot of paperwork and drama for me, but I also knew it was exactly the kind of compromise that could get me into serious legal trouble if something went wrong. No, Francis. We have to handle this properly. He nodded, with the complete resignation of someone who'd known this day would come eventually. He zipped up his backpack, turned off the flashlight, and followed me out of the warehouse to the security office. During the walk, I tried to process everything that had just happened. If Francis was telling the truth about his sister, then he was in an impossible situation and had made desperate choices. But if he was lying, I didn't want to think about the other possibilities for what those chemicals could be used for. In the security office, I asked Francis to sit while I figured out exactly how to handle the situation. Technically, I should call the police immediately. Stealing hazardous chemicals was a federal offense, but I also felt I owed Francis a chance to explain himself fully before things spiraled out of control. Okay, Francis, I said. Tell me the whole story from the beginning. And I mean the whole story. Francis took a deep breath and started talking. According to his account, his sister Laura had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 months earlier. The doctors had given her less than a year to live and had exhausted conventional treatment options after standard chemotherapy failed to stop the cancer's progression. Francis, with his chemistry background, had started researching alternative and experimental treatments. He'd found several studies on compounds that showed promise in lab settings but weren't available for human use due to a lack of clinical trials or prohibitive costs. Most of these compounds, he explained, are relatively simple to synthesize if you have access to the right base chemicals, and I have enough training to do it safely. But have you been testing these compounds on your sister? Only after months of research. I've been testing them on cell cultures first, then on lab mice I bought online. That added another layer of complexity. Not only was he stealing chemicals, he was conducting unauthorized medical experiments. Francis, you realize this goes way beyond simple theft, right? You're talking about unauthorized medical experimentation, administering unapproved drugs. I know, he interrupted. I know exactly what I'm doing and what the risks are. But I also know that without this, my sister's going to die anyway. There was genuine passion in his voice, the kind of desperation that only comes from facing the loss of someone you love. But there was also something else, a certainty, a confidence in his own abilities that worried me. Have you consulted any doctors about this? Any oncologists? I've tried, but as soon as you mention experimental treatments, they shut down. They say it's too risky, that there's not enough evidence, that it could do more harm than good. Maybe they're right. Francis looked at me sharply. Have you ever watched someone die of cancer, Raoul? Have you seen how conventional treatments destroy them while the cancer keeps growing? Sometimes the risk is worth it. I didn't have an answer for that. I had no personal experience with that situation, and I couldn't judge the decisions someone would make when faced with the imminent loss of a loved one. But I also knew my personal feelings didn't matter. Francis had committed multiple serious crimes, and it was my responsibility to report him. Francis, I understand your situation, and I sympathize, but I can't just ignore what you've been doing. I have to report this. He nodded sadly. I understand. I picked up the phone to call Tom Bradley, the night supervisor, who would, in turn, have to contact management and likely the police. But Francis stopped me before I could dial. Raoul, is there any way we can do this without involving the police right away? Just until I can make arrangements for my sister. If I get arrested now, there'll be no one to take care of her. It was an understandable plea, but I didn't have the authority to make that kind of decision. I can't promise you that, Francis, but I can explain the situation when I make the report. Francis stayed silent as I called Tom and briefly explained what I'd discovered. Tom, as expected, was shocked but responded professionally. Keep Francis there until I get there, he told me, and don't touch anything in the warehouse until we can document everything properly. The next 30 minutes, waiting for Tom to arrive, were some of the most uncomfortable of my life. Francis sat quietly, occasionally glancing at his phone as if considering calling someone, but never did. Finally, I asked, "Does your sister know what you've been doing?" "No," he replied immediately. "She thinks I've been buying the drugs online from clinics in Mexico." "And has it been working?" "The treatments, I mean." Francis hesitated. "It's hard to say. Her condition stabilized a bit, but it could be a coincidence." Something about his hesitation made me suspect that the situation with his sister might not be exactly as he described. When Tom arrived, he brought the plant manager, Mr. Davidson, and, surprisingly, 2 police officers. Francis had been right to worry. This had immediately become a criminal matter. The next 2 hours were a blur of statements, documentation, and police procedures. Francis cooperated fully, admitting everything he'd done and providing details about which chemicals he'd taken and when. What emerged during the police questioning was a slightly different story from the one Francis had initially told me. First, when the officers contacted the hospital where his sister was supposedly being treated, they had no record of any patient by that name. Second, when they asked for his sister's address so they could verify her condition, Francis provided an address that turned out to be an empty apartment. Third, and most disturbing, when the officers examined the contents of Francis's backpack, they found not only the chemicals I'd seen, but also several compounds already synthesized into small vials labeled with codes Francis refused to explain. "What are these specific compounds for?" one of the officers asked. Francis stayed silent. "Are they for your sister?" More silence. "Francis, do you actually have a sister with cancer?" That's when Francis finally broke. "Yes," he said quietly, "but she's not in the hospital. She died 3 months ago." The silence in the room was absolute. "Then what were the chemicals for?" the officer pressed. Francis looked around the room, then at his hands. "Research." "What kind of research?" "Just research." They couldn't get more out of him. Francis had completely shut down, responding only with no comment or silence to all further questions. The officers took Francis away that morning. They also took all the evidence, including the chemicals from his backpack and samples of the residues I'd found in the lab. In the days that followed, more details about Francis's situation emerged through the police investigation. It turned out that Francis had indeed had a sister named Laura, and she had died of cancer, as he'd said. But she died 6 months before Francis even started working at Chemtech, not 3 months after, as he'd eventually admitted. The story about experimental cancer treatments had been completely fabricated. What investigators found in Francis's apartment was disturbing in an entirely different way. He had an elaborate home laboratory set up in his basement, complete with advanced chemistry equipment he'd been purchasing for months. There were dozens of vials labeled with various compounds, many of which couldn't be immediately identified. More worryingly, they found what appeared to be a detailed research journal where Francis had been documenting experiments with various chemicals and compounds. The entries included observations about toxicity, dispersal methods, and effects on test subjects that weren't identified. But the test subjects weren't lab mice, as he'd mentioned. Investigators found evidence that Francis had been testing his compounds on stray animals he'd been capturing from the neighborhood. The journal contained entries like Subject 15, domestic cat, approximate weight 4 kilograms. Compound 7, A administered via ingestion, effects observed after 23 minutes, death after 47 minutes. There were dozens of similar entries, systematically documenting the effects of various chemicals on live animals. When police questioned Francis's neighbors, several reported that their pets had gone missing mysteriously over the past few months. One elderly man had seen Francis putting out poisoned food in his backyard to lure stray cats. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was what they found on Francis's computer. He'd been researching not only chemistry, but also methods of dispersing chemicals in public spaces. He'd downloaded blueprints of public buildings, schedules of large events, and information about ventilation systems in shopping malls and office buildings. In a folder labeled Final Project, investigators found what appeared to be a detailed plan to release some kind of chemical compound into the ventilation system of a shopping mall during Black Friday. The plan included specific timelines, methods for entering the building, and calculations about how much compound would be needed to achieve maximum dispersal and effectiveness. It wasn't clear whether Francis actually intended to carry out this plan or if it was just an elaborate fantasy, but the investigation suggested he'd been seriously preparing for some kind of chemical attack. The chemicals he'd been stealing from Chemtech weren't for experimental cancer treatments. They were components to synthesize what chemical experts later identified as an extremely potent neurotoxin that could be fatal in very small concentrations. Francis never admitted what his true intentions were. Even after the evidence was presented, he maintained that it had all been just research and that he'd never planned to hurt anyone. In the end, Francis was charged with multiple federal offenses: theft of hazardous materials, animal cruelty, possession of chemical weapons, and conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism. But here's the part that disturbs me most. Due to legal technicalities and the lack of direct evidence that he'd planned to use the chemicals against humans, most of the more serious charges were reduced or dropped. Francis pleaded guilty to theft and animal cruelty and was sentenced to only 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. The company chose not to publicize the incident to avoid negative publicity. Officially, Francis had been terminated for security protocol violations. Most employees never knew the real story. I could never stop thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't decided to do that extra search that morning. Would Francis have continued his research until he completed his final project? How many people could have died if he'd managed to release his chemicals in a public place? I was also haunted by the fact that I'd been interacting with Francis regularly for months without suspecting anything. He'd seemed like a quiet but normal employee. He'd never shown obvious signs of mental instability or violent intentions. How many other people are out there who seem completely normal on the surface but are secretly planning horrible things? How many times do we interact with potential monsters without realizing it? Francis was released from prison 18 months ago, exactly as predicted. According to the justice system, he'd paid his debt to society and deserved a second chance. But I know what I saw in his apartment. I know what he'd been planning. And I know that someone with that mindset doesn't just change because they spent time in prison. I don't know where Francis is now. I probably shouldn't know. Victims and witnesses don't get automatic updates on the whereabouts of released criminals. But I sometimes wonder if he's landed another job at some chemical company, if he's found new sources for the materials he needs. I wonder if he's continuing his research. The experience fundamentally changed me. I can no longer see my coworkers as just ordinary people doing ordinary jobs. There's always a part of my mind that's assessing, watching, looking for signs that something's not right. It's a paranoid way to live, but it also makes me feel like I'm doing my duty as a security guard. My job isn't just to protect property. Sometimes it's to protect society from the people working right beside us every day. In the end, that's what disturbs me most about this whole experience. Not the stolen chemicals, not the sinister plans, not even the dead animals they found in Francis's apartment. It was realizing that I'd worked side by side with someone capable of those things for months, had conversations with him, been polite to him, even considered him a decent coworker, and not once, not a single time, did I suspect what he really was. In the end, I caught him stealing materials from the company, acids and other chemicals that seemed destined for sinister intentions, but we never really knew what he planned to do with it all. The company simply fired him, and the justice system let him go after a minimal sentence. Francis Kyler is still out there somewhere, and that keeps me awake at night. My name is Amelie, and for 2 years I worked at a small but bustling pub in Camden, London. What I'm about to tell you changed not only my perspective on working in hospitality, but on human nature in general. It's a story about how someone can seem completely normal and harmless at first, only to gradually reveal a nature that goes far beyond what anyone should have to endure. I'll start from the beginning, because to understand what happened, you need to know about my job and why I didn't initially see the warning signs that now seem so obvious. The Anchor and Hope was a traditional British pub located on a busy corner near Camden Market. During the day, it attracted mostly tourists and local workers stopping by for lunch, but at night, it transformed into a popular spot for young professionals and university students. It wasn't the fanciest pub in London, but it had character, a loyal regular clientele, and, most importantly for me at the time, good hours that allowed me to study during the day while completing my master's degree at University College London. I worked mostly night shifts, from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., 4 days a week. The job was exactly what you'd expect: serving pints, mixing basic cocktails, handling the cash register, and dealing with customers who gradually became louder and less coordinated as the night went on. The staff was small but tight-knit. There was Charlie, the manager in his 50s, who had run pubs his entire life and knew every trick to keep things in order. Sophie, a girl my age who was also studying at university, and James, the head bartender, who had worked there for 5 years and knew most of the regulars by name. Regular customers are an inevitable part of working in any pub. You develop friendly professional relationships with them. You learn their favorite drinks, ask about their jobs or families, but keep clear boundaries between being friendly and being friends. Most regulars understand and respect this distinction. David Thompson was not one of them. David started coming to the pub in early September, just when I had been working there for about 6 months and felt comfortable with the routine. At first, he seemed exactly like any other potential regular, a professional man in his 30s, well-dressed, polite, who came alone 2 or 3 times a week after work. He was attractive in a conventional way. Dark brown hair, always neatly combed, expensive suits, a smile that reached his eyes when he spoke to you. He worked in something finance-related in the city, though he was never specific about exactly what he did. He had the quiet confidence that comes from being successful and well-educated. His first visits were completely normal. He'd order a pint of London Pride, sit at the bar, read the Evening Standard, or check his phone, and leave after 1 or 2 drinks. He was polite to the staff, left decent tips, and never caused any trouble. The first real conversation we had was about my accent. I had grown up in France, but moved to London for university, and though my English was fluent, I still had a slight French accent that people occasionally noticed. "Where in France are you from?" he asked one night, when the pub was relatively quiet. "Lyon originally, but I lived in Paris for a few years before coming here." "Paris is beautiful. I've been there for work several times. Do you miss France?" It was the kind of small talk you have hundreds of times working in hospitality, so I didn't think anything of it. David seemed genuinely interested, but not intrusive, asking polite follow-up questions about my studies and how I was adjusting to life in London. Over the next few weeks, these conversations became a regular part of David's visits. He always sat at the same section of the bar where I worked and always found ways to start conversations when there was a quiet moment. At first, I appreciated the company. Working in a bar can be socially exhausting. You're constantly on, being friendly and conversational with dozens of different people each night. But with David, the conversations felt more genuine, less like work, and more like chatting with an intelligent acquaintance. He'd ask about my classes, my plans after graduation, my opinions on various current events. He was the kind of person who actually listened to your answers and remembered details from previous conversations. He seemed impressed by my education and professional ambitions, which was refreshing in a job where many customers saw me as just the bar girl. It was during my second month of knowing David that I started noticing his visits becoming more frequent and predictable. Instead of coming 2 or 3 times a week at varying times, he started coming specifically on the nights I worked. He'd always arrive around 8 p.m. and stay until close to when my shift ended. If I had a night off, he wouldn't show up. If I picked up an extra shift, somehow he knew and appeared. When I asked him about it casually, he said he'd been extra busy at work and could only unwind on certain nights of the week. It was a plausible explanation, and I had no reason to doubt it at the time. He also started bringing small gifts occasionally, nothing extravagant or inappropriate. A book he thought I might like based on something I'd mentioned, French chocolates he'd seen in a fancy shop that reminded him of my home, a small souvenir from a business trip to Paris. "It's nothing special," he'd always insist. "Just a little something I thought you'd appreciate." At first, the gifts felt genuinely thoughtful. David paid attention to the things I said and remembered details about my interests. He seemed like the kind of person who was naturally generous and considerate with people he cared about. But gradually, the gifts became more frequent and personal. Instead of books or chocolates, he started bringing things like a scarf he thought would look beautiful on me, or a perfume that reminded him of me when he saw it in a shop. The gifts came with elaborate stories about where he'd seen them and why he'd thought of me, stories that seemed designed to show how much time he spent thinking about me. It was around this time that James, the head bartender, started making comments about the attention David was giving me. "That guy really fancies you, doesn't he?" he said one night after David had left. "He's just friendly," I replied. "Probably just lonely. A lot of single professionals are." "Maybe," James said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Just be careful. I've seen this kind of thing before. Sometimes customers mistake professional kindness for something more." In hindsight, James was right to be concerned, but at the time, I felt he was being overprotective. David had never done anything overtly inappropriate. He'd never been aggressive or made sexual comments. He'd never asked for my personal number or suggested meeting outside of work. But what I didn't realize at the time was that David was being very careful about how he escalated his behavior. Each new action was only slightly more intense than the last, just enough to gradually normalize increasing levels of attention without immediately setting off my alarm bells. The turning point came in early November. I'd been working at the Anchor and Hope for 8 months by then, and David had been a regular for nearly 3 months. His visits had become so predictable that the staff started joking about him as my bar boyfriend, something that made me uncomfortable, but that I tried to brush off. One particularly busy Thursday night, David arrived at his usual time, but the pub was packed and noisy. I didn't have time for the long conversations that had become routine, and I could tell he was visibly frustrated by the lack of my attention. When the pub finally quieted down around 11 p.m., David called me over. "You've been really busy tonight," he said, and there was something different in his tone. It wasn't his usual friendliness. There was an edge, a hint of irritation, possessiveness. "Sorry," I replied automatically. "It's been a crazy night. I hope you're not ignoring me on purpose." The statement caught me completely off guard. It had been said as a joke, but his facial expression didn't match the light tone. There was an intensity in his eyes I hadn't seen before. "Of course not," I said, trying to keep my voice professional and friendly. "Just trying to keep up with everyone." "Good," he said, and his smile returned. "Because I really enjoy our conversations. They're the highlight of my week." That statement made me deeply uncomfortable in a way I couldn't fully articulate at the time. There was something about the way he said it that felt like pressure, as if I was being informed I had an obligation to him that I hadn't agreed to. After that night, conversations with David started to feel different. He was still polite and charming on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of expectation that hadn't been there before. It felt like he'd crossed some invisible line in his mind, as if our professional relationship had become something more in his perspective. He started making comments about my appearance that, while technically compliments, felt inappropriate coming from a customer. "That color really brings out your eyes," he'd say, about a shirt I was wearing. Or, "Have you done something different with your hair? It looks beautiful." Individually, these comments could have been harmless, but the pattern was starting to feel like he was assessing me, studying me, giving the kind of attention that went beyond casual conversation. It was during this period that I started noticing David knew things about my schedule that I hadn't told him. "Are you working tomorrow night?" he'd ask, even though I'd never specifically discussed my schedule with him. When I asked how he knew when I was working, he'd say things like, "Oh, James mentioned you'd be here," or "I thought I remembered you saying something about working Fridays, but I started paying closer attention and I realized neither James nor anyone else on staff was discussing schedules with customers. And while I'd occasionally mentioned working certain days, I'd never been as specific as David seemed to think. I began to suspect that David was calling the pub on days I wasn't working to ask if I'd be there, or that he was driving by the pub to check if my car was in the staff parking lot. This suspicion was confirmed when Sophie casually mentioned that a man had called several times asking about my schedule. "He said he was your friend and wanted to surprise you by showing up when you were working," Sophie told me. But something about it felt off, so I didn't tell him anything. When I described David, Sophie confirmed it matched the voice on the phone. That realization made me feel like someone had walked over my grave. David had been actively investigating my schedule, calling the pub to get information about me without my knowledge or consent. I decided I needed to set clearer boundaries. The next time David came in, I kept our interactions strictly professional. I was polite but distant, avoided personal conversations, and made sure other staff members were nearby when I had to serve him. David noticed the change immediately. "Is everything okay?" he asked, after I brought him his drink with a professional smile, but without starting a conversation. "Everything's fine," I replied. "Just really busy tonight." But the pub wasn't particularly busy, and we both knew it. "Have I done something to upset you?" he pressed. "Not at all," I lied. "Just keeping things professional." The expression that crossed David's face in that moment is something I'll never forget. For a second, the mask of charm slipped completely, and I saw something cold and angry in his eyes. It was only for an instant before his smile returned, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. "Of course," he said softly. "Professional is good." But the message in his tone was clear. This wasn't over. Over the next few weeks, David continued coming to the pub just as often, but our interactions became tense. He was still superficially polite, but there was an undercurrent of resentment that made me deeply uncomfortable. He started making passive-aggressive comments about my new attitude and how I'd changed since we first met. He'd imply I'd been friendlier before, as if my current professionalism was some kind of personal betrayal. But what really alarmed me was when he started showing up in places outside of work. The first time I saw him outside the pub was on a Saturday afternoon when I was shopping at Sainsbury's near my flat. David was at the end of the aisle, seemingly examining cereals, but when our eyes met, he smiled and walked over. "Amelie! What a coincidence." "Hey David," I replied, trying to sound casual despite my heart racing. "You live around here?" he asked, looking around the store as if it were his first time there. "In the area," I answered vaguely. "Me too. What a small world." But I knew David lived in a completely different part of London because he'd mentioned his address in Canary Wharf during our early conversations. There was no reason for him to be shopping at this specific Sainsbury's unless he'd come here deliberately. I finished my shopping quickly and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling I'd been followed. The second time was a week later, when I was leaving the UCL library after studying. David was standing at the bus stop across the street, but when he saw me, he pretended to be surprised and crossed over to talk to me. "I can't believe we keep running into each other like this," he said, but his smile didn't seem genuinely surprised. That night, when I got to work, I mentioned the encounters to James. "That's creepy," he agreed. "Are you sure you didn't tell him where you live or study?" I was sure. I'd been deliberately vague about specific personal details in all our conversations. "Maybe you should mention this to Charlie," James suggested. "If this guy's following you, that's stalking." But when I considered talking to Charlie about it, I realized I didn't have any real evidence. Technically, David hadn't done anything illegal. Showing up at the same public places as me wasn't a crime, especially when he could claim they were coincidences. I decided to wait and see if the pattern continued before making a formal accusation. I didn't have to wait long. Over the next 2 weeks, David showed up in my life outside of work 4 more times. At a cafe where I'd gone to study, at the tube station near my flat, walking down my street when I was coming home from university, at the laundromat I used. Each time, he acted surprised to see me, as if they were chance encounters, but it was mathematically impossible for them to be coincidences. David was stalking me. The realization filled me with a kind of fear I'd never experienced before. It wasn't fear of immediate violence, but something more insidious, the understanding that someone was invading my privacy and safety in a way that felt deeply violating. I started changing my patterns. I took different routes home. I went to different shops. I varied my study hours, but somehow, David always seemed to know where to find me. That's when I realized he'd probably been following me for much longer than I'd noticed. The chance encounters I'd noticed were likely just the times he'd let me see him. How many other times had he been watching me without me knowing? The thought made me sick. I finally decided I needed to tell Charlie what was going on, evidence or not. Charlie Wilson had been managing pubs for 20 years and had seen every kind of customer trouble. When I explained the situation, he took me completely seriously. "That's definitely stalking," he said without hesitation. "And if he's following you, it could escalate into something worse." Charlie agreed to ban David from the pub, but wanted to handle the situation carefully to avoid a confrontation that might make David more aggressive. "People like this often get more dangerous when they feel cornered," he explained. "We'll document everything, and if he shows up after we've told him he's not welcome, we'll call the police immediately." Charlie spoke to David the next time he came to the pub. I couldn't hear the full conversation, but I saw David growing increasingly agitated as Charlie talked. Several times, he glanced over at where I was working with an expression that can only be described as furious. When Charlie finished talking, David left without saying a word, but the look he gave me as he walked out made me feel like I'd just made a terrible mistake. "How did he take it?" I asked Charlie. "Not well," Charlie admitted. "He denied stalking you, said it was all a misunderstood coincidence. But when I told him he wasn't welcome here anymore, he got pretty ugly. Definitely stay alert for the next few weeks. Charlie was right to be concerned." Although David didn't return to the pub, his stalking in other ways escalated dramatically. He started showing up outside my flat. At first, just occasionally, standing across the street or sitting in his car where he could see my window. When I noticed he was there, he'd leave. But the message was clear. He knew exactly where I lived, and he wanted me to know he knew. Then the phone call started. My number wasn't listed, and I'd never given it to David, but somehow he'd gotten it. The first calls were mistakes. He'd call, and when I answered, he'd pretend he'd dialed wrong and apologize. But the calls came at odd hours, early in the morning, late at night, and after the third one, I stopped believing they were accidents. Then the calls became more direct. David would call and talk as if we were old friends who'd had a falling out. "I know you're upset with me," he'd say, "but I think there's been a misunderstanding. We can work this out if you just talk to me." When I hung up, he'd call back immediately, and again, and again. One night, I received 17 calls from David between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. Eventually, I had to unplug my phone to get any sleep. Then the letters started. The first one arrived a week after David had been banned from the pub. It was a handwritten 3-page note explaining how he felt misunderstood and betrayed by my behavior. "I thought we had a real connection," he wrote. "I don't understand why you suddenly acted like I was a stranger. All I wanted was to be your friend." The letter included specific details about our conversations that showed he'd been taking careful mental notes of everything I'd said over months. The subsequent letters became progressively more disturbing. He started writing about how he'd been forced to follow me because I hadn't given him a chance to explain himself properly. He described my daily routines with a level of detail that made it clear he'd been watching me far more closely than I'd realized. "I know you take the number 134 bus at 9:15 on Tuesdays and Thursdays to get to university," he wrote in one letter. "I know you get coffee at Pret before your 10 a.m. class. I know you study on the second floor of the library because it's quieter than the first." Reading those letters made me realize how completely he'd violated my privacy. David had been building a detailed profile of my life for months, documenting my habits and movements as if I was some kind of scientific experiment. But what scared me most were the letters where he started expressing ownership over me. "I've invested so much time in getting to know you," he wrote. "I've been so good to you, so thoughtful. It's not fair that you cut me off like this after everything I've done for you." The implication was clear. David felt he'd earned some kind of right to me through his months of attention, as if I were an investment that now owed him some kind of return. In another letter, he wrote, "I know you're probably seeing someone else. It's the only explanation for why you suddenly pushed me away. But whoever he is, he doesn't know you like I know you. He hasn't put in the time and effort I have. I wasn't seeing anyone, but the letter made me realize David had built an entire narrative in his mind about our relationship that had very little to do with reality. It was around this time that I decided I needed to go to the police. The officer who took my report was sympathetic but honest about the limitations of what they could do. "What you're describing is definitely harassment," Sergeant Williams told me. "But until he does something that constitutes a direct threat or violates a legal order, our options are limited." "What if it escalates?" I asked. "If he ever threatens you directly, if he shows up at your workplace after being told not to, or if he does anything that makes you feel in immediate physical danger, call us right away. We'll keep this report on file so we have a record of the pattern of behavior." The police contacted David to warn him that his behavior constituted harassment and that any further contact with me would result in charges. They also helped me get an informal restraining order that barred David from coming near my flat, my university, or my workplace. For a few days, I thought it had worked. The phone calls stopped. I didn't see David at any of my usual places. No more letters arrived. But then he started using intermediaries. The first was a woman who came to the pub one night specifically asking for me. She introduced herself as a friend of David's and said she'd come to clear up the misunderstanding. "David's really torn up about this whole thing," she told me. "He just wants to apologize properly. Could you at least hear what he has to say?" When I told her I had no interest in talking to David under any circumstances, she got aggressive. "Do you know how much you've hurt him?" she asked. "He was genuinely good to you, and you treated him like garbage." Charlie had to step in and ask her to leave. Then the gifts started arriving through delivery services. Flowers, chocolates, books, all with notes claiming to be from anonymous admirers, but clearly from David based on the specific references to our past conversations. David had found ways to continue his harassment campaign while technically avoiding violating the restraining order. He also started using social media to monitor me. Though I'd never been connected with him on any platform, I started noticing fake accounts following me that were clearly him. The profile pictures were of generic male models, but the activity patterns and listed interests matched things David knew about me. One account liked every photo I'd posted over the past 2 years in the span of a single night. Another started commenting on my posts with observations only someone who knew me personally would have made. I realized David had been building a digital profile of me as detailed as his physical surveillance. The harassment continued like this for months. David had found dozens of ways to keep his presence in my life without doing anything that technically violated the legal orders against him. I changed my phone number 3 times, but somehow he always got the new one. I moved to a different flat, but within a week there were anonymous flowers delivered to my new address. The constant stress of living under surveillance was affecting every aspect of my life. I couldn't focus on my studies. I avoided going out socially because I didn't want David to learn information about my friends. I developed chronic anxiety and trouble sleeping. The worst part was the sense of helplessness. David had found ways to make me feel constantly watched and harassed without crossing the lines that would result in serious legal consequences for him. Finally, I decided I couldn't keep living like this. In March, 6 months after David had been banned from the pub, I gave my notice at the Anchor and Hope. Charlie completely understood and offered me an excellent reference. "You shouldn't have to change your life because of this jerk," he told me. "But I understand why you can't stay." My plan was to finish the semester, then move to a different city to complete my master's. I hoped that putting physical distance between David and me would finally end the harassment. On my last night of work, David showed up. He'd been banned from the pub for months, but somehow he'd known it was my final night. He arrived just before closing time, when only a few customers remained. Charlie immediately approached to kick him out, but David raised his hands. "I just want to talk to Emily for 5 minutes, he said. "Then I'll leave, and you'll never see me again." "No way," Charlie said. "You leave now, or I'm calling the police." But David had already accomplished what he'd come to do. He'd seen me, made eye contact, and smiled in a way that let me know he knew exactly what he was doing. "See you around, Amelie," he said as Charlie escorted him to the door. "Have a safe trip." The implication was clear. He knew I was leaving, and that information wouldn't make me free of him. That night, I went straight to the police station to report David's violation of the pub ban, but by the time officers got to his flat, David was gone. According to his landlord, he'd packed up and left that same night. I moved to Edinburgh a week later to finish my master's at the University of Edinburgh. For the first few months, I lived in constant anxiety, expecting David to show up in my new city. But gradually, as weeks passed without incident, I started to believe it was finally over. I never saw or heard from David Thompson again. Over the next 3 years, I gradually rebuilt my life. I finished my master's, got a good job in marketing, developed new friendships, even started dating romantically again. The constant hypervigilance I developed during the months of harassment eventually faded, but I never completely forgot the experience. It changed my perspective on interactions with strangers, on boundaries in professional relationships, and on how quickly someone seemingly normal can reveal an obsessive and potentially dangerous nature. Then, 2 weeks ago, I saw an article in The Guardian that made me feel like I'd seen a ghost. London man arrested for multiple counts of harassment and extortion. The photo accompanying the article was unmistakably David Thompson, though he looked several years older and had gained considerable weight. According to the article, David had been arrested for stalking multiple women over a period of 5 years. The charges included harassment, illegal surveillance, extortion, and even assault in one case. The pattern described in the article was chillingly familiar. David targeted young women working in customer service, developed one-sided relationships with them, and then escalated to intense harassment when they rejected his advances. But what disturbed me most was the scale of his operation. Investigators had found detailed files on 16 different women in his flat. Each file contained photographs, detailed schedules, personal information, and even audio recordings taken without consent. One of the victims had been blackmailed with intimate photos David had secretly taken. Another had been assaulted when she tried to get a restraining order against him. David had been doing this for years, systematically refining his methods and becoming more sophisticated in how he stalked and controlled his victims. The article mentioned that investigators believed there might be additional victims who hadn't yet come forward, and provided contact information for anyone who had similar experiences. I called the number immediately. The detective handling the case told me my information would be extremely valuable in establishing David's pattern of behavior and potentially adding more charges. "Your case is one of the earliest we've documented," she explained. "It helps show how his methods evolved over time." Apparently, after our situation, David had refined his approach. He had become more careful about staying within legal boundaries, more sophisticated about using technology for surveillance, and more manipulative about using others to do his dirty work. But he'd eventually escalated to more serious crimes that were easier to prosecute. "He's looking at significant prison time," the detective told me. "Between all the victims and all the evidence we found, he'll be off the streets for a long time." I quit my job at the Anchor and Hope over 3 years ago, and I never heard from David again until today, when I saw in the news that he was arrested for harassment, extortion, and many other things. Knowing that David is finally facing consequences for his actions brings some closure, but it also makes me think about all the women who came after me. How many had to endure what I experienced, or worse? It also makes me feel incredibly lucky that my experience didn't escalate into something more dangerous. Based on what I read about his later cases, he was clearly capable of far more than what he did to me. But more than anything, it reminds me that my instincts had been right all along. That uneasy feeling I'd had about the intensity of David's attention, those small boundary violations I'd tried to rationalize, they'd all been valid warning signs. Sometimes people tell you you're being paranoid or overreacting when you express discomfort about someone's behavior that hasn't technically done anything wrong. But my experience with David taught me that trusting your instincts about people can literally save you from dangerous situations. David Thompson is now in prison, where he belongs, but I still think about him sometimes, especially when I'm working late at night. I wonder if there are others like him out there, meticulously studying their targets, building files, waiting for the right moment to make their move. It's a thought that keeps me vigilant, even years later, because I learned the hard way that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who seem the most normal on the surface. My name is Frank, and for 12 years I've served as a police officer in Greater Manchester. I work almost exclusively nights, the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift that most officers avoid, but that I've always preferred. The nights are when you truly see what a city is made of, when the darker elements of human nature come to the surface, and when you feel like your work really matters. In 12 years patrolling the streets of Manchester, after dark, I've seen just about everything you can imagine. Violent robberies, domestic disputes that end in tragedy, horrific car accidents, overdoses, murders. I've had to notify families about deaths, chased criminals down dark alleys, disarmed men with knives, and witnessed humanity at its lowest moments. I thought nothing could surprise or scare me after more than a decade on the night streets. I was wrong. What I'm about to tell you happened 8 months ago, on a February night that changed my perspective on my job, my personal safety, and how vulnerable anyone can be, no matter their training or experience. But I'll start from the beginning, because to understand why what I discovered that night disturbed me so much, you need to know what my job is normally like, and why that particular night felt different from the moment my shift began. I work out of the Moss Side police station, covering an area that includes some of Manchester's toughest neighborhoods. It's not the kind of place tourists go strolling at night, but it's home to thousands of hardworking people who deserve the same level of police protection as any other part of the city. My usual partner is Pete Morrison, a 20-year veteran who taught me most of what I know about nighttime police work. Pete and I have developed the kind of partnership that's essential for police work: absolute trust, instant communication, and the ability to anticipate each other's reactions in high-stress situations. But on that night of February 14th, Pete was out sick with the flu, so I was assigned to work alone. It wasn't unusual. All officers are trained for solo patrols when necessary, but I preferred having backup, especially in our coverage area. The shift started routinely. The first few hours were the typical calls: a domestic dispute at a council estate, a noise complaint at a pub, an abandoned car that turned out to be legally parked. By 2 a.m., I'd handled 4 minor calls and was doing preventive patrols through the areas where we typically saw nighttime criminal activity. It was during one of these patrols that I started to notice something strange. I was driving down Claremont Road, a quiet residential street that's usually completely deserted after midnight. But that night, I noticed the same car, a dark blue Ford Mondeo, parked in 3 different locations over the course of 2 hours. The first time I saw it, it was parked near a bus stop around 12:30 a.m. The second time, at 1:45 a.m., it was about 4 streets away, parked under a broken streetlight. The third time, around 2:20 a.m., it was on a side street parallel to my patrol route. Individually, none of these sightings would have been significant. People have perfectly legitimate reasons for moving their cars at night, but the pattern caught my attention because the car always seemed to be in places where it would have a clear view of my patrol. I decided to investigate more closely. The fourth time I saw the Mondeo, at 2:50 a.m., it was parked in a residential parking zone on Alexandra Road. I pulled up slowly, using my headlights to illuminate the interior of the vehicle. The car was empty, but there was something on the passenger seat that made me pause. It looked like a thick folder with photographs scattered on top. From my angle, I couldn't see the details, but the photos appeared to be of outdoor settings, buildings, streets, maybe surveillance shots. I ran the car's plates through the system. The vehicle was registered to a Michael Davies with an address in Bolton, about 30 kilometers away. There were no alerts or criminal history associated with the owner or the vehicle. I decided to wait and see if anyone returned to the car. I parked where I had a clear view, but wasn't obvious about watching, and I waited. 20 minutes passed with no activity. Just as I was considering resuming my patrol, I saw two figures walking down the street toward the Mondeo. They were two men, both dressed in black, moving with the kind of deliberate caution you develop when you don't want to be noticed. One was tall and lanky, the other shorter and stockier. Both wore caps that obscured their faces, and the taller one was carrying what looked like a large duffel bag. My training immediately put me on high alert. The men's behavior, their attire, the hour, and the fact that they'd apparently been following my patrol for hours all suggested potential criminal activity. But instead of approaching the Mondeo, the men walked right past it and continued down the street. They moved with purpose, as if heading to a specific location. I decided to follow them on foot to see what they were up to. I exited my patrol car quietly and trailed them at a safe distance, staying in the shadows and using parked cars as cover. My radio was set to silent mode, and I had my hand on my baton, ready for anything. The men walked for about 5 minutes before stopping in the middle of a small intersection where Elm Street and Oakfield Road crossed. It was a quiet residential area, no businesses nearby, no nighttime foot traffic. The streetlights provided decent illumination, but there were enough shadows to conceal activity if someone was careful. What they did next was completely unexpected. The taller man opened the duffel bag he was carrying and began pulling out what initially looked like long white sticks. But as he arranged them on the pavement, I realized they weren't sticks. They were bones, human bones. From my hidden position behind a parked car, I watched with growing horror as the two men meticulously arranged what was clearly a complete human skeleton in the center of the intersection. They worked silently but efficiently, as if they'd practiced this procedure before. The skeleton was laid out in anatomically correct position, arms at the sides, legs extended, skull at the top. Even from a distance, I could tell the bones looked old, bleached, as if they'd been buried for years before being unearthed. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Once the skeleton was fully arranged, the shorter man pulled something from his jacket. Even in the dim light, I could see it was a photograph, a large photo, at least 20 by 25 centimeters. He placed it carefully on the skeleton's chest, then pulled out several smaller photographs that he arranged around the skull like a macabre crown. From my distance, I couldn't see what the photographs showed, but something about the way the men had placed them suggested they were significant to whoever was meant to find them. After they finished with the photographs, both men stood and looked at their work for a moment. Then, without an audible word, they packed up the empty bag and started walking back toward where I'd come from. They were heading straight toward my position. I had seconds to decide what to do. I could confront them immediately, but it was 2 against 1, and I didn't know if they were armed. I could call for backup, but that would take time, and the men might escape. Or I could let them go and investigate what they'd left in the intersection. My instincts won out over my training. I stayed hidden until the men passed my position and disappeared into the darkness. Then, with my flashlight in one hand and my radio in the other, I cautiously approached the center of the intersection. What I saw when I shone my flashlight on the photographs made my blood run cold. The large photograph on the skeleton's chest was of me. It wasn't an official police department photo or something that could have been publicly obtained. It was a photo taken without my knowledge, likely with a telephoto lens, showing me exiting my personal car outside my flat. I was wearing civilian clothes I recognized from a few days earlier. The smaller photographs around the skull were all of me too. Several had been taken during work shifts, entering and exiting the police station, sitting in my patrol car, talking to civilians during routine calls. Others were from my personal life, shopping at the supermarket, at the gym, dining at a restaurant with my girlfriend Sarah. There were at least a dozen photographs in total, all taken over what must have been weeks or even months of surveillance. But what terrified me most was a piece of paper folded beneath the skull. With shaking hands, I unfolded it and read what was written. In careful block letters, someone had written, "Officer Frank Collins, we know where you live. We know your routine. We know when you're vulnerable. This is just a warning." Below that was a detailed list of personal information about me that made my stomach churn. My full address, including apartment number, Sarah's full name and her workplace, the license plate of my personal car, my mobile phone number, the schedule of my shifts for the past month, my parents' names and their address in Liverpool, even the name of my veterinarian and information about my dog, Max. It was as if someone had been building a complete profile of my life for months. At the bottom of the page was a final line that hit me like a physical blow. Next time, it won't just be bones. With hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the radio steady, I called for backup. "Control, this is Unit 47. I need multiple units at the intersection of Elm Street and Oakfield Road immediately. I also need a detective and the forensic team." "What's the nature of the emergency, Unit 47? I didn't know how to explain what I'd found without sounding like I'd lost my mind. I've got human remains in the public roadway and evidence of threats against an officer. Just send everyone you can." The next 20 minutes, waiting for backup to arrive, were some of the longest of my life. I stayed by the skeleton, documenting everything with my mobile phone while constantly looking over my shoulder to make sure the two men hadn't returned. The scene transformed quickly once backup arrived. Within an hour, I had detectives, forensic technicians, additional patrol officers, and eventually my supervisor, Sergeant Davies, all working to process what I'd found. The skeleton was photographed in situ, then carefully collected for forensic analysis. The photographs and note were sent immediately to the fingerprint lab. The entire area was cordoned off as a crime scene, while technicians searched for any additional evidence. The initial investigation revealed some disturbing facts. First, the skeleton was definitely human, and according to the preliminary examination by the forensic pathologist, it belonged to an adult male who had been dead for at least 5 years, possibly longer. The bones showed signs of having been buried for an extended period before being unearthed. Second, the photographs of me had been taken over a period of at least 3 months, as evidenced by the variation in my clothing and the weather conditions shown in the images. Some had been taken with professional surveillance equipment. The images were crisp and clear, even when I'd been photographed from considerable distances. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, several of the photographs had been taken from locations that required illegal access. One showed me through the window of my flat. Another had been taken from the roof of a building that was supposed to be locked to the public. Detective Inspector Williams, who was assigned to lead the investigation, had me sit down for a detailed interview about any potential enemies I might have made during my career. "In 12 years of police work," he asked, "can you think of anyone who might have a grudge serious enough to do this?" It was a question I'd been asking myself since the moment I saw the photographs. Like any police officer, I'd arrested hundreds of people over the course of my career. I'd testified in court against criminals who were sentenced to significant prison time. I'd been involved in drug raids that resulted in multiple arrests, but the elaborate nature of what I'd found, the extended surveillance, the skeleton, the macabre symbolism, suggested something that went beyond typical criminal revenge. "Honestly," I told Williams, I can't think of anyone specific. I've had threats before, but nothing like this. What about recent cases? Anything that might have triggered an extreme reaction? We reviewed my cases from the past 6 months, but nothing stood out as particularly controversial or likely to generate this level of animosity. The investigation into the Ford Mondeo revealed another layer of mystery. The car had been reported stolen 3 days before I saw it during my patrol. The real owner, Michael Davies from Bolton, had a solid alibi for the entire week and no apparent connection to me or my work. More disturbing, when forensic technicians examined the car, they found evidence that it had been used specifically for surveillance. There were multiple modified cameras discreetly mounted on the dashboard, audio recording equipment, and detailed maps of my patrol area with my usual routes marked in highlighter. In the boot, they found what can only be described as a full surveillance kit: high-powered binoculars, a camera with a telephoto lens, dark clothing, even food rations, as if someone had been prepared to watch me for extended periods. But perhaps the most unsettling find was a notebook in the glove box. It contained handwritten entries documenting my movements for the past 8 weeks with almost obsessive precision. January 7th, FC leaves work, 6:15 a.m., stops at Tesco on way home, arrives flat, 6:45 a.m. January 9th, FC night shift, usual Moss Side area patrol, stops for coffee, 2:30 a.m. at Shell Station. January 12th, FC day off, sees movie with girlfriend at Odeon Printworks, dined at Italian restaurant afterward. Page after page of similar observations, each showing that whoever was doing this had detailed knowledge of both my professional and personal life. There were also sections of the notebook dedicated to what appeared to be vulnerability analyses. FC flat, second floor, 1 fire escape, front door with standard lock. Gym route, walks alone, dark alley near the end, no security cameras. Girlfriend Sarah, works late Tuesday, Thursday, walks alone to car in underground parking. It was as if someone had been developing a detailed plan to, what? Kidnap me? Harm Sarah. The investigation continued for weeks, but it gradually became clear that whoever was responsible had vanished completely. There were no usable fingerprints on any of the evidence. Security cameras in the area where I'd found the skeleton hadn't captured clear images of the 2 men. The stolen car had been meticulously wiped clean of any DNA evidence. Even the skeleton turned out to be an investigative dead end. Forensic analysis confirmed it belonged to a man who'd been dead for years, but it didn't match any missing persons in our databases. It was as if it had been obtained specifically for this macabre purpose. After 6 weeks of intensive investigation, Detective Inspector Williams called me in for a meeting. "Frank," he told me, "I'm going to be honest with you. We've exhausted just about every lead. We don't have suspects, we don't have a clear motive, and we don't have evidence that points us to who did this. So what happens now? We keep the case open, of course, and we put additional safety measures in place for you and Sarah. But realistically, unless this person makes another move or slips up, we may never know who it was or why they did it." The realization that I might never get answers was almost worse than the initial incident. In the months that followed, my life changed fundamentally. The department implemented additional safety protocols for me, including regular check-ins during my shifts and restrictions on working alone. I was offered the chance to transfer to a different area or switch to day shifts, but I declined both. I wasn't going to let whoever did this dictate my professional decisions, but the psychological effects were impossible to ignore. I developed constant hypervigilance, always looking over my shoulder, always scanning my surroundings for potential threats. Every car that seemed to follow me during patrols, every person who seemed to pay me extra attention, every unexpected noise at night, everything became a potential source of danger. Sarah was affected too. The knowledge that someone had been watching her, documenting her movements, assessing her vulnerabilities, filled her with the same kind of paranoid anxiety I was experiencing. We started constantly varying our routines. We took different routes to work, switched gyms, even moved to a flat in a building with better security. But no matter how many precautions we took, the feeling of being watched never fully went away. The worst part was not knowing whether the threat was real and ongoing, or if it had been a one-off event meant simply to terrorize me. Were the perpetrators still out there, watching, waiting? Had they accomplished what they wanted, scaring me, and moved on? Or was this really just a warning, as the note had said, with something worse planned for the future? Not having answers to these questions was what finally led me to seek professional help. Dr. Rebecca Hartwell was a psychologist specializing in work-related trauma for police officers. During our sessions, she helped me understand that my reactions were completely normal given what I'd experienced. What you went through, she explained, was a specific form of psychological terrorism. The message was clear. We've been watching you. We know your intimate life, and we can get to you whenever we want. It's natural that this has created lasting anxiety. The sessions with Dr. Hartwell helped me develop coping strategies for the constant hypervigilance and anxiety. I learned relaxation techniques, ways to realistically assess threats versus paranoia, and methods to maintain some sense of normalcy in my life. But even with professional help, I could never fully shake the feeling that this experience had changed something fundamental about how I viewed my job and my personal safety. For 12 years as a police officer, I'd been used to being the one responding to threats, the one providing safety and protection to others. Discovering that I'd been stalked and assessed by unknown people for months without my knowledge made me realize how vulnerable I really was. It also made me question how many other officers might be watched in similar ways without knowing it. How many criminals or unstable individuals are out there building detailed files on police officers, waiting for the right moment to act. The case officially remains open, but there have been no significant developments in the 8 months since it happened. Occasionally, Detective Inspector Williams calls to check if I've noticed anything unusual or if new threats have emerged, but each time the answer is the same: nothing. In a way, the lack of follow-up has been both a relief and a continued source of anxiety. On one hand, it suggests that whoever was responsible has moved on or lost interest. On the other hand, it means I've never gotten the closure that comes from knowing who did it and why. I continue working night shifts in Moss Side, and gradually I've started to feel more like myself again. The constant hypervigilance has calmed to a more manageable level, though it never fully goes away. Pete returned to work after recovering from his flu, and having a regular partner again has helped significantly with my anxiety. It's easier to keep perspective when you have someone else watching your back, but there are still nights, especially when I'm working alone, when I see a car that seems to be following my patrol route, or when I notice someone who seems to pay me extra attention, that all the paranoia comes rushing back. And there are still questions that keep me awake some nights. Who were those 2 men? How did they get a human skeleton? Why did they specifically target me? Was the encounter random? Were they waiting for any lone officer that night? Or had it been specifically planned for me? More disturbing, how long had they been planning this? The level of surveillance documented in that notebook suggested months of preparation. What had been the ultimate goal? Was this really just a warning, as the note said, or was it part of a larger plan that was aborted for some reason? And the question that haunts me most, are they still out there? I've never felt as much fear as I did that night when I shone my flashlight on those photographs and realized someone had been documenting my life for months. I never learned anything more about it. I didn't find out who those men were, what they wanted to do with me, or whether our encounter was random or specifically planned by them. After that experience, I had several sessions with Dr. Hartwell that helped me process the trauma and develop strategies to manage the ongoing anxiety. But even now, 8 months later, I know that night changed something in me permanently. As a police officer, you're trained to expect danger from criminals you encounter during calls, people you arrest, situations that escalate unexpectedly. But you never expect to discover that someone has been quietly studying your life for months, assessing your vulnerabilities, planning something. That realization that I'd been hunted without knowing it by people with unknown but clearly sinister intentions was more terrifying than any direct threat I'd faced in 12 years of police work. And the fact that I never got answers, that those people simply vanished into the night as mysteriously as they'd appeared, means that threat always feels like it could return at any moment. It's a hard way to live, but I've learned to function with that uncertainty. And I continue doing the job I love, protecting the streets of Manchester, now with a much sharper understanding of how unpredictable and dangerous this world can really be. Hello everyone, my name is Thomas, and I live in a quiet suburb outside Dallas, Texas, where the summer nights are hot and sticky, and the only sounds you hear are the crickets chirping like an endless choir and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog responding to invisible ghosts. I'm now 42 years old, working as a truck driver for a local delivery company, taking long hauls that keep me on the road for hours, alone with the hum of the engine and the radio tuned to old country stations for company. It's a solitary job, but that suits me. After what happened, I prefer the solitude of the truck cab to noisy crowds. It gives me time to think, to reflect on life, though sometimes those thoughts take me to dark places I'd rather avoid. But when I was 32, things were different. I was a security guard at a gated community called Oak Ridge Estates, one of those upscale neighborhoods with houses that look like they belong in architecture magazines, lawns manicured like miniature golf courses, and residents who pay fortunes for the illusion of absolute safety. The job wasn't glamorous at all. It was mostly driving a golf cart at night, checking doors that were always locked, shining a flashlight that felt more like a toy than a serious tool on suspicious shadows, and dealing with the occasional drunk resident who forgot their key fob after a party that ran too long. The pay was decent, enough to cover rent on my shared house in a modest part of town and save a little for a future I then imagined full of possibilities. It gave me time to think, sometimes too much, about life, about why I'd ended up in a night job, guarding the wealthy, while I struggled to make ends meet. I never imagined that job would lead me to the nightmare I'm about to tell you. This isn't a made-up tale, not a horror story for passing the time. It's what happened to me one night 10 years ago, and it's haunted me ever since, like a shadow that stretches with the sunset. If you scare easily, you might want to stop reading now, because this is the kind of real-life horror that sticks with you, lodged in the back of your mind, making you question every dark corner of your house, every fleeting glance from a stranger on the street, and every impulsive decision you make, thinking you're doing the right thing. It all started in the year 2015, a period of my life I now see as a bridge between carefree youth and a maturity marked by cynicism. I'd been working as a security guard for about 3 years after bouncing through several temp jobs that had left me exhausted and disillusioned. Construction under the scorching Texas sun, where dust and sweat became a second skin. Bartending at a dive bar where cigarette smoke and the stench of spilled beer followed me home each night. Even a brief stint in a logistics warehouse where the constant noise of forklifts left me with perpetual headaches. Oak Ridge Estates was my stable job, my anchor in a sea of instability. Night shifts from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 days a week, with weekends off that I usually spent sleeping or watching football games with friends at a local bar. The community was high-end, an enclave of luxury where doctors with impossible schedules, lawyers defending multi-million-dollar corporations, and tech executives who talked about startups like they were the world's salvation lived. Their homes were modern palaces with illuminated pools that glowed like jewels at night, 3-car garages filled with luxury vehicles, and alarm systems that cost more than my annual salary. My partner on most shifts was a guy named Mike, a retired cop in his 50s, with a belly that betrayed years of donuts and sleepless nights, and a no-nonsense attitude that cut like a knife. We got along well. He'd tell stories from his days on the force, tales full of adrenaline about car chases, drug busts, and nights when he'd seen the worst of humanity. I'd listen as we patrolled the perimeter, the golf cart humming softly on the pristine asphalt, the house lights twinkling like artificial stars. The job was boring 99% of the time. False alarms from motion sensors triggered by curious raccoons, teenagers sneaking in to smoke weed behind the clubhouse, or forgetful residents needing us to open the gate because they'd lost their access card. But that 1%, God, it could get serious. And when it did, it reminded you that the world wasn't as safe as it seemed from the comfort of a lit-up guard shack. The night it all happened was a Tuesday in August, a day that had started like any other. I woke up late in my messy bedroom, with sunlight filtering through broken blinds, made a quick breakfast of scrambled eggs and burnt toast, and spent the afternoon watching TV without really paying attention, just killing time until my shift. The heat was infernal, even after sunset, with that thick humidity that makes your shirt stick to your back like glue, and the air felt heavy, charged with the promise of a storm that never came. Mike and I were in the main gate's guard shack, a small building with a faulty air conditioner that barely kept the mugginess at bay, drinking bad coffee from styrofoam cups that tasted like melted plastic, and staring at old monitors where security cameras flickered like tired eyes. Around 11:30, everything was quiet. Most residents were fast asleep in their king-size beds, and the only traffic had been a pizza delivery guy earlier, a young kid with a lopsided cap who dropped off a steaming box at a house on Elm Street. I was scrolling through my phone, checking sports scores for the Texas Rangers, who were having a mediocre season, when Mike nudged my arm, spilling a bit of coffee on the desk. "Look at camera 4, he said, his voice low but urgent, pointing to the screen covering the back gate, the one near the woods that bordered the community. It was a less used gate, mainly for maintenance crews, trimming hedges or fixing fences, surrounded by thick trees that swayed like silent sentinels, and a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire that deterred casual intruders. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the metal gate gleaming under the yellow sodium light, the gravel path fading into the darkness like a snake's tongue, and the trees moving with the night breeze. their leaves whispering secrets no one heard. But then, a subtle movement caught my eye. A white van approached slowly, headlights off, as if it didn't want to announce its arrival. It stopped just outside the gate, and two guys got out. Big, burly men in dark hoodies that covered their torsos and worn jeans that had seen better days. One of them, the taller one, approached the fence, looking around as if scanning for cameras or unseen witnesses, while the other, stockier, went to the back of the van and opened the doors with a metallic creak that the camera's audio faintly picked up. "What the hell?" I muttered, leaning forward to zoom in with the remote. The quality wasn't great, grainy black and white that made everything look like it was from an old movie, but I could see something moving inside the van, something that didn't fit with a normal delivery or a lost resident. At first, I thought it was cargo shifting, maybe boxes sliding across the floor, but then I realized, with a chill that ran down my spine, children. Two small children, about 8 or 9 years old, stumbling out of the back as if they'd been pushed from inside. They looked terrified, their faces pale and dirty under the gate's security light, clothes wrinkled and torn in places that suggested a struggle. One was a boy with messy hair and wide, panicked eyes, the other a girl clinging to his arms like her life depended on it, her small shoulders trembling visibly, even in the pixelated image. "Call Central," Mike said, already grabbing the radio with one hand while zooming in further with the other. But before he could key it up, the men noticed the kids escaping. The one by the fence spun around sharply, cursing loud enough for the audio to catch it clearly. "Damn it!" and lunged toward them with surprising speed for his size. The boy, acting with a bravery that left me stunned, pushed the girl toward the gap under the gate, a small space where curious animals or playful kids sometimes slipped through, and shouted, "Run!" She hesitated for a second, looking at him with eyes full of panic, but he shoved her again with urgency, and she crawled under the fence, scraping her knees on the rough gravel, leaving small bloodstains that the camera caught as dark spots. By then, Mike was on the radio, his voice steady and honed by years on the force. "Central, this is Oak Ridge, Gate 1. We've got a situation at the back gate, possible kidnapping in progress. 2 suspects, white van, 2 minors involved. One of the kids is inside the perimeter. Send backup now. Repeat, send backup immediately." I didn't wait for Central's confirmation, which I knew would come in seconds, but we couldn't afford to lose. I grabbed the keys to the patrol cart hanging on the dashboard, a rickety electric thing that felt more like a golfer's toy than an emergency vehicle, and bolted out the shack's door, with Mike right behind, his breathing heavy but determined. The back gate was about 2 kilometers away through the neighborhood's winding roads, a maze of curves designed to keep residents' privacy, but now feeling like a deliberate obstacle. At top speed, maybe 20 kilometers per hour in that cart that buzzed like an angry bee, we could get there in 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes felt like an eternity. My heart pounded like a war drum, adrenaline coursing through my veins like liquid fire, as if I'd downed 10 energy drinks at once. "What if they grab the kids before we get there?" I yelled over the hum of the cart's motor, the warm wind whipping my face as we sped through the empty streets, passing lit-up houses where families dined, oblivious to the horror unfolding in their backyard. "We won't let them," Mike yelled back, his hand steady on his holster, eyes fixed on the road ahead. As a security guard, I wasn't armed, just had a heavy flashlight that could double as a club in a pinch, and a pepper spray that seemed laughable against the threat we faced. But Mike, being an ex-cop with a past in urban patrols, had a concealed carry permit and always kept a Glock 9mm in a holster under his uniform. "If they try anything, I'll handle it. You focus on the kids. We rounded the final curve with a screech of tires that broke the night silence, and there was the scene unfolding like a nightmare in real time. The van still parked, engine running and faintly smoking, one man trying to crawl under the fence after the girl, with grunts of frustration, the other holding the boy by the collar of his shirt, landing a hard slap across his face that echoed like a crack in the audio of my mind. The boy fought like a possessed demon, kicking and screaming, "Let me go! Help!" with a high-pitched voice that cut through the air like a knife. The girl had made it inside the perimeter and was running toward the nearby houses, her little legs moving with desperation. But she stopped abruptly when she saw us approaching in the cart, her eyes wide with a mix of primal fear and desperate hope, as if we were angels descending from the sky. Mike leaped from the cart before it fully stopped, drawing his Glock with a fluid motion that betrayed his years of police training. "Hey, let the kid go. Security. Hands where I can see them," he shouted with an authority that made even me stand straighter, his stance solid as a rock. The man holding the boy froze for a second, his eyes scanning the scene with calculated panic, then shoved the boy hard toward the van like a sack of garbage and ran for the driver's door, stumbling slightly on the gravel. The other guy, halfway under the fence, scrambled back out with muffled curses, scraping his arms in the process, and bolted for the passenger side, throwing a murderous glare our way. I ran toward the boy, who was on the ground, dazed but alive, coughing and rubbing his neck where his shirt had choked him. "Stay down!" I yelled to the boy, my voice shaking despite my efforts to sound in control, then turned toward the van just as its engine roared to life. The tires spun on the gravel, kicking up a cloud of dust that stung my eyes as they tried to peel out. Mike, without hesitation, fired a warning shot into the air. Boom! A deafening sound that reverberated through the night like thunder, and the van swerved sharply, nearly crashing into a tree, but the driver corrected and kept accelerating, disappearing into the darkness of the rural road like a ghost fleeing. "Damn it," Mike muttered, lowering the gun with steady hands but visibly tense, holstering his Glock and pulling out his phone to call 911 with a quick motion. "Get the kids to safety, Thomas. I'll handle the cops, and make sure they don't move until the ambulance gets here." The boy was crying now, rubbing his face where he'd been hit, a red mark swelling like ripe fruit under the light of the flashlight I pulled from my belt. The girl ran back from where she'd stopped, throwing herself at him and hugging him tightly, sobbing uncontrollably. "Tommy, are you okay?" she cried, her small hands clutching his shirt, as if she feared he'd vanish if she let go. "Yeah, sis," he said, hugging her back with a tenderness that broke my heart, his voice choked with tears, but trying to sound strong for her. "We're okay now. These guys helped us." I knelt to their level, trying to project calm, though my hands shook like leaves in a storm, my pulse still pounding in my ears like a war drum. "Hey, little ones, you're safe now. What are your names?" I asked, forcing a smile I hoped looked comforting, while scanning their faces for any serious injuries. "I'm Tommy," the boy said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving streaks of dirt on his cheeks. "This is my sister, Lily. Those guys, they took us from the park 2 days ago. 2 days. My God," I thought, imagining the hell they must have gone through in that van, alone and terrified. "Where are you from?" I asked, helping them up gently, noting how they leaned on each other like an indivisible unit, and guiding them to the cart where they could sit in the back seat, away from the fence that had nearly been their prison. "From Richardson," Lily said, her voice faint and halting, as if speaking took physical effort. We were playing in the park, and they grabbed us. They said they were taking us to see Mom, but Mom wasn't there. They kept us in the van, tied up with ropes. It hurt a lot, and we were hungry, and her voice broke into a sob, and Tommy hugged her tighter. Rope marks that explained the red, inflamed lines on their wrists and ankles, raw and bruised, as if the skin had been scraped to bleeding. I felt sick seeing them up close, imagining the terror of being tied up in the darkness of a van for 2 days, not knowing if they'd see their parents again. "You're brave kids," I told them, my voice hoarse with emotion. I tried to hold back. "The police are coming. They'll take you home to Mom and Dad. Everything's going to be okay." Now Mike was already coordinating with dispatch over the phone, his voice professional and calm as he gave a detailed description of the van. White Ford Econoline, no visible plates or possibly fake ones I couldn't read in the dark. 2 white males in their 30s, one with a snake tattoo on his neck, based on the grainy camera footage we'd quickly reviewed before rushing out. Yeah, they fled east on County Road 42. Armed? Possibly. I didn't see weapons directly, but they were roughing up the kids with brute force. One of them slapped the boy across the face, and the other was trying to crawl under the fence to grab the girl. Sirens wailed in the distance within minutes, a faster response than I'd expected for a gated community like Oak Ridge, where influential residents likely had direct lines to the police department. 2 patrol cars screeched to a stop on the gravel, lights flashing like beacons in a storm, and officers piled out with guns drawn, securing the area with military efficiency. One of them, a young officer with a trimmed mustache, took the kids gently and led them to an ambulance that roared up shortly after, its sirens cutting through the night like a cry of relief. Meanwhile, another officer, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression, questioned Mike and me under the flickering light of the patrol cars. "We saw it all on the security cameras," I explained, my voice still shaky from the adrenaline that wouldn't fade, showing the video on my phone. I'd had the foresight to quickly record the monitor screen before running out of the shack, capturing the exact moment the kids escaped and the men reacted. They were trying to, I don't know exactly, dump the kids or leave them in the neighborhood to make it look like abandonment or something. But the kids escaped under the fence, and one of them got inside the perimeter. The officer nodded, scribbling furiously in a notepad, while Mike added details about the warning shot and the van's escape. "Good eye, guys. These kids match a missing persons report from 2 days ago. An Amber Alert was issued for 2 siblings from Richardson. The parents are frantic, been calling every station in the state." As the ambulance took Tommy and Lily away, with paramedics checking their injuries and wrapping them in thermal blankets to combat shock, the boy looked at me through the back window and mouthed, "Thank you," his eyes still full of tears, but now with a glimmer of gratitude. I nodded, trying to smile, but inside I was wrecked, a knot in my stomach that wouldn't untie. What if we hadn't been watching the cameras at that exact moment? What if the shift had been slow and we'd been distracted by some banal conversation? What if those bastards had gotten away with the kids before we could intervene? The question swirled in my head like a whirlwind, mixed with relief that at least this time we'd made it in time. The police caught the men 3 hours later. The van crashed into a ditch on Interstate 35, a violent impact that left the vehicle flipped like a dead beetle. Both suspects tried to flee on foot through the adjacent fields, but were nabbed by highway patrol, alerted via radio. It turned out they were part of an organized human trafficking ring, kidnapping kids for ransom, or, in darker cases, to sell on black markets I preferred not to imagine. The van had false compartments hidden under the floor, filled with restraints like zip ties, industrial duct tape, and injectable sedatives in unlabeled vials, sick things that made me question the humanity of those who used them. Interrogations revealed that Tommy and Lily had been taken from a public park in Richardson, an innocent place where kids played without worry, and the men planned to transport them across state lines for an anonymous buyer. The thought churned my stomach for weeks. The kids' parents came to the station the next day to thank us in person, an encounter I still remember with a mix of warmth and sadness. Tommy and Lily's mom, a woman in her 30s with deep circles under her eyes that betrayed sleepless nights, hugged me so hard I thought she'd crack my ribs, tears streaming down her face like overflowing rivers. "You saved my babies," she sobbed, her voice broken with emotion, clinging to my uniform like it was a lifeline. The dad, a tall man with a scruffy beard and red-rimmed eyes, shook my hand hard, his words choked. "We owe you forever. If you hadn't been there, God, I don't even want to think about it." I told them how we'd seen it on the cameras, how Mike had reacted with cop instincts, and they nodded, soaking up every detail like it was a balm for their pain. They gave me a handmade commemorative plaque engraved with Heroes of Oak Ridge and promised to keep in touch, though I knew then that life would take them down other paths. The media caught wind quickly. Local news called us heroes in the morning headlines, running detailed stories about the vigilant guards who thwarted a kidnapping in an exclusive community, with photos of us posing by the patrol cart like we were movie stars. Mike and I got commendations from the city in a formal ceremony where the mayor handed us medals and a small check from a victims fund that barely covered a month's rent but felt like validation. The community threw a barbecue at the clubhouse, with residents slapping our backs like we were local superheroes, offering free beers and telling us how they felt safer because of us. For a while, it was surreal. TV interviews where they asked how it felt to be an everyday hero, and I answered modestly, saying we were just doing our job, though inside I felt like an imposter, because the real heroism had been the kids escaping that infernal van. But here's where it gets dark, the part that still haunts me, like a shadow that doesn't fade with daylight. A week after the initial euphoria, when the media attention was starting to wane and life seemed to be returning to normal, I started getting calls. Anonymous, blocked numbers showing up on my phone as unknown, always at odd hours, midnight, 3 a.m., just as I was trying to fall asleep after an exhausting shift. The first was seemingly harmless, heavy breathing on the other end, like someone was gauging my reaction, then a low, raspy whisper, "You shouldn't have gotten involved." Click. The phone went silent, and I sat up in bed, staring at the lit screen, thinking it was a bad prank from some bored teenager who'd seen the news. But the calls kept coming, growing more frequent and threatening. "We know where you live," said a distorted voice, like they were using a modulator to sound inhuman. "Watch your back, hero." Another night. Those kids weren't yours to save. I'd wake with my heart in my throat, cold sweat soaking my sheets, and during the day, paranoia grew like a weed. Mike got them too, and it was he who confirmed what I feared. "It's the ring," he said one night, over beers at a dim bar near the shop where I used to work days to supplement my pay, his face pale under the low light of the lamp. "They've got associates, people protecting their interests. We messed with their operation, and now they want payback." Mike, with his cop experience, knew what he was talking about. He'd seen cases where witnesses were harassed, or worse, by cartels or organized gangs. The police investigated when we reported the calls, sending a detective who jotted notes in a worn notepad and promised to trace the numbers, but there were no solid leads. Burner phones bought with cash, impossible to track. Calls bounced through proxy servers that hid the origin. "Could be just pranksters," the detective said with a shrug, but his expression said otherwise. He knew that in trafficking cases, threats weren't empty. I installed security cameras at my shared house, small wireless units I bought from a local electronics store, set up to send alerts to my phone if they detected motion. I got a concealed carry permit, a process that took weeks of mandatory classes and endless paperwork, and bought a compact handgun I kept in a safe by my bed. I started varying my routes home after shifts, taking random detours through back streets, constantly checking my rearview mirror for cars tailing me. Paranoia took hold like a thick fog. Every shadow in the guard shack's parking lot seemed like a man lurking. Every stranger who stared too long at the gas station became a potential spy for the ring. One night, I swore I saw a white van like theirs parked across the street from my house, headlights off, but engine running, a low hum cutting through the silence. I ran out with my gun in hand, heart hammering in my chest, but by the time I crossed the street, the van peeled out and sped away, leaving me standing in the dark, panting and feeling like a lunatic. The threats escalated subtly. One morning, I found my car tires slashed in my driveway, clean, precise cuts, like someone had used a sharp knife to carve the rubber in deliberate patterns. It wasn't random vandalism, it was a message. I called the police again, and they came to take photos and a report, but with no witnesses or forensic evidence. The case was filed as minor vandalism. Mike had a similar incident. His mailbox was smashed, and inside he found a scrawled note. "Heroes die young." We shared the stories, trying to laugh it off to ease the tension, but inside, fear took root like a weed. "Maybe we should quit the job," Mike suggested one night, watching a baseball game at his place. But we both knew it wasn't that simple. If the ring had marked us, moving or changing jobs wouldn't erase the target on our backs. The kids testified at the trial months later, brave souls who broke my heart with their resilience. Tommy, the older one, described in a trembling voice how the men grabbed them at the public park, an innocent place where they played soccer with friends, tying their hands with zip ties that cut into their skin and throwing them into the van like packages. They said if we screamed, they'd hurt our mom, take her somewhere no one would find her, he testified, his eyes avoiding the defendants in the dock. Lily, the younger, had nightmares for months, her mother told me in a later call. She'd scream in the night, reliving the terror of the darkness in the van, the stench of sweat and fear, the roar of the engine pulling them away from home. The trial was a media circus, with reporters crowded outside the courthouse, cameras flashing like stars in a cloudy night. The men, sitting in cheap suits that didn't hide their prison tattoos, claimed absurdly that the kids climbed into the van on their own, playing explorers or something. Pure nonsense that didn't hold up against the evidence. Rope marks on the kids' wrists, bruises shaped like hands where they'd been grabbed, and DNA evidence on the ropes found in the van. Their lawyer, a sweaty guy with a loose tie, argued external coercion, tried to paint the defendants as duped transporters for a bigger ring, not intentional kidnappers, but the jury didn't buy it. They saw through the lies and found them guilty on all counts: first-degree kidnapping, endangering minors, aggravated assault. 25 years to life for each, a sentence that felt like justice, though nothing could erase the trauma of those 2 hellish days for Tommy and Lily. But the calls didn't stop. even after the sentencing that should have closed the chapter. Whispers in the night came like ghosts. "This isn't over," a distorted voice said, followed by low laughter that chilled my blood. "You paid for interfering, but the price goes up." I tried blocking numbers, changing phones, but they always found a way. Texts from unknown numbers with photos of my house taken from the street, or anonymous emails with personal details no one should know, like my mother's name or the bar I used to hit on Fridays. The police investigated again, installing a tracker on my line, but the calls bounced through international servers, impossible to pin down. "Could be a stalker obsessed with the news," a detective suggested, but I knew it was the ring, retaliating from the shadows. I moved to Seattle 2 years later, leaving Dallas and its sticky memories behind, changing my number once more and starting fresh in a city where the constant rain washed the streets like it was trying to erase the past. Mike stayed in Texas, but last I heard, he quit security altogether, turned into a recluse in a remote cabin, cut off from the society he once swore to protect. "I don't trust anyone now," he told me in our last call, his voice tired and defeated. "I still hike in the Olympic forests, but never alone, and always with a satellite phone that guarantees connection even in the most remote areas, a knife in my boot, and a gun in my backpack. The woods that once felt like freedom now whisper warnings in every breeze, reminding me that evil doesn't always come with sirens and lights. Sometimes it hides in the mundane, waiting for the moment to strike. Those kids are safe, grown now. Tommy's in college, studying law, planning to become a prosecutor to fight crimes like the one he endured. Lily's an artist, painting landscapes that capture the world's beauty, but with dark touches that betray her inner scars. We send Christmas cards every year. Their mom says they're okay, but forever marked, with weekly therapy and a constant vigilance that steals their innocence. Me? I now drive long roads in solitude, occasionally watching out for the lost and vulnerable who venture into the wilderness, unaware of the dangers lurking. But deep down, I know evil hides in quiet places, disguised as normalcy. And sometimes, when the wind moves the leaves just right, I hear that whisper again. You shouldn't have gotten involved. It's a reminder that helping a stranger can save lives, but it can also cost you your own in ways you never imagine. If you're thinking about stepping into something that looks wrong, do it, but brace for the consequences. Stay safe out there, because the world doesn't always reward heroes. Sometimes it hunts them. Hello everyone, my name is Kyle, and I have to admit I'm embarrassed to tell this story. It's not easy to talk about something that's marked me so deeply, something that still wakes me up at night with my heart pounding like it's trying to escape my chest. I live in a small village on the outskirts of Sheffield, United Kingdom, where life is quiet, almost dull, with cobbled streets and pubs that seem frozen in time. I'm now 35 years old, working as a delivery driver for a courier company, driving a white van through rural roads, dropping off packages at farms and isolated houses. It's a solitary job, but I like it. It gives me space to breathe, to think, though sometimes those thoughts take me to dark places I'd rather avoid. But 10 years ago, when I was 25, my life was different. I worked the night shift at a petrol station on the A57, a road that winds through hills and forests, connecting Sheffield to Manchester. It was one of those places forgotten by time, with rusty pumps and a flickering neon sign that barely lit the night. The job was monotonous, but it paid the bills, and at that age, that was enough. I never imagined that one night at that petrol station would change my life forever, leaving me with nightmares that still haunt me and 3 weekly visits to a psychologist. If you scare easily, you might want to stop here, because what I'm about to tell isn't fiction. It's a terrifying memory, a real experience that taught me that true fear doesn't come from ghosts or monsters, but from people, from the things they're capable of doing in the dark. It was the summer of 2015, a time when I was trying to find my place in the world. I dropped out of university after 1 year studying mechanical engineering. It just wasn't for me. Numbers and machines didn't speak to me like I'd hoped, so I ended up working temp jobs, warehouses, bars, even a brief stint as a newspaper delivery boy. The petrol station on the A57 was my first stable job in a long time. It was a night shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week. It wasn't glamorous, cleaning sticky floors, restocking shelves with crisps and chocolate bars, and dealing with occasional customers, mostly exhausted lorry drivers or late-night travelers looking for coffee or fuel. The petrol station was a small building lit by buzzing fluorescent lights that sounded like insects, and a counter protected by a glass panel that was supposed to make me feel safe, though I never questioned it then. Outside, the pumps were surrounded by a cracked asphalt car park, and beyond that, a dense forest that seemed to swallow the moonlight. My boss, a grumpy guy named Dave, had warned me about the weird customers who showed up now and then, drunks, lost travelers, or teenagers looking for trouble. But he said, as long as I stayed calm and kept the emergency phone handy, I'd be fine. Just keep your eyes open, he told me once, patting my shoulder. I didn't think much of it. After all, it was just a petrol station in the middle of nowhere. The night it all happened was a Wednesday in July, one of those warm, muggy nights where the air feels heavy, like it's charged with something you can't name. I'd been working at the petrol station for about 6 months, and I'd gotten used to the routine, counting cash in the till, cleaning coffee spills left by customers, and listening to the local radio, tuned to an indie music station to stay awake. That night, the place was quieter than usual. I'd only had one customer in the last 2 hours, a lorry driver who bought a Red Bull and a plastic-wrapped sandwich before disappearing down the road. I was alone in the shop, sitting behind the counter, flipping through a car magazine someone had left behind, when I heard the crunch of gravel in the car park. I looked out the window and saw a car pull up by pump number 3, a dark sedan, maybe a Ford Mondeo, with peeling paint and a license plate partially covered in mud. I didn't think much of it. Beat-up cars weren't uncommon on that road, especially at night. A man got out, tall, about 40 years old, wearing a worn leather jacket and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He had short, graying hair and a several-day-old beard that gave him a scruffy, but not necessarily threatening look. He walked toward the shop with slow, almost deliberate steps, as if measuring each movement. When he came in, the door's bell chimed with its usual high-pitched beep, and I straightened on my stool, setting the magazine aside. "Good evening," I said, forcing a professional smile. "How can I help you?" The man didn't answer right away. He stood in the doorway, looking around the shop, as if sizing it up, his eyes scanning the shelves, the counter, and then, unsettlingly, me. There was something in his gaze that made me uneasy, a cold glint I couldn't decipher. "Just looking," he said finally, his voice low and raspy, like he smoked a pack a day. He walked over to the snack counter, running his fingers over the crisp packets like he was playing piano keys, but he didn't grab anything. Then he went to the drinks fridge, opened the door, and stood there, staring at the cans of cola and beer like they were works of art. Need help with anything? I asked, trying to keep the conversation light, though my instincts told me something was off. I'd dealt with odd customers before, guys muttering to themselves, drunks trying to nick a beer, but this man had something different, a calculated calm that set my nerves on edge. "You work alone here?" he asked, not turning around, his voice cutting through the hum of the fluorescent lights. The question caught me off guard. No one had asked me that before. Not like that, as if he was fishing for information rather than making small talk. Yeah, tonight I do," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my hand instinctively slid toward the landline phone under the counter, where I knew I could dial 911 if things got weird. "Night shift, you know." He turned his head slowly, looking me straight in the eyes for the first time. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and there was something in them that made me swallow hard. "Must be lonely," he said, with a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "All night here, alone, no one around." "You get used to it," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "Besides, I've got the radio for company." He didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed a can of Coca-Cola from the fridge, closed the door with a sharp thud, and walked to the counter. He set the can in front of me, but didn't pull out money right away. He just stood there, staring at me, his hands resting on the counter, fingers tapping slowly. "How old are you, kid?" he asked, his tone so casual it almost seemed normal, but there was an undercurrent, something that made my skin prickle. 25, I answered, scanning the can quickly to keep my hands busy. "That's £1.20, please." He pulled a crumpled bill from his pocket, placed it on the counter, and when I handed him his change, his fingers brushed mine for a second longer than necessary. It was a brief touch, but enough to make me pull back instinctively. "Easy, kid," he said, with that same half smile. "I don't bite." I nodded, not knowing what to say, and he left the shop, Coca-Cola in hand, his silhouette fading into the darkness of the car park. I heard the car's engine start and saw the headlights flick on as he drove off down the A57 toward Manchester. I stared at the empty road for a few minutes, trying to shake off the unease he'd left behind. Just a weird guy, I told myself, going back to my magazine, but I couldn't focus. Something about him, his way of talking, his stare, had stuck with me, like a stain you can't scrub off. The rest of the night passed without incident, just a couple more customers, a taxi driver buying tobacco, and a young couple asking for directions after getting lost on the road. But when I locked up the petrol station at 7 a.m., with the sky turning gray and birdsong breaking the silence, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. I went home to my small flat above a fish and chip shop in the village center and slept poorly, waking every hour with the feeling that someone was standing at the foot of my bed, though I was alone. Over the next few nights, I tried to convince myself I'd overreacted. The petrol station attracted all sorts of characters. It was part of the job. But that Friday, he came back. It was around 1 a.m., and I was restocking the sweets shelves, my back to the entrance, when the bell chimed. I turned, expecting another tired lorry driver, but it was him. Same leather jacket, same dirty jeans, same piercing stare. My stomach tightened. "Good evening again," he said, that gravelly voice crawling across the floor. "Still working alone?" "Yeah," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted. "What do you need this time?" He walked to the counter without answering, his steps slow and deliberate, and leaned against the glass, so close I could smell the old leather of his jacket mixed with something else, maybe tobacco or something sharper I couldn't place. "You're a good kid, aren't you?" he said, leaning in a bit closer. "Hardworking, responsible." I liked that I tried to stay calm, remembering Dave's instructions. Keep the conversation short. Don't give personal information. Just doing my job, I said, stepping back. You buying something? He grabbed a Snickers bar from the display by the counter, placed it in front of me, and pulled out another crumpled bill. But this time, he didn't move after I gave him his change. He stood there, staring at me, his breathing slow and audible. You should be careful, Kyle, he said, and my heart lurched at hearing my name. I didn't remember telling him, and my name tag only said assistant. People aren't always what they seem, especially at night. How do you know my name? I asked, my voice shaking despite my effort to sound firm. He laughed, a low, dry sound that gave me goosebumps. Heard it around, he said, shrugging. Small village, right? People talk. He left the shop before I could respond, and again, I watched him get into his car and drive off down the road. But this time, I wasn't calm. I checked the security camera system, rewinding the footage to see if anything was suspicious, but it only showed his car pulling up, him coming in and leaving. Nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling that something was wrong stayed with me, like a weight on my chest I couldn't ignore. Over the weekend, I tried to distract myself. I went to the local pub with some mates, had a couple of pints, played pool, but I couldn't get the man out of my head. His voice, his stare, the way he said my name. On Monday, when I went back to work, I told Dave about him, hoping he'd say I was being paranoid. But Dave frowned, scratching his chin. Sounds like a guy trying to mess with you, he said. Keep your eyes open, and if he comes back, don't let him hang around long. Call the police if he gets weird. That warning stuck with me, and over the next few nights, I made sure to keep the phone close and the back door locked, something we didn't usually do because it was a quiet village. But the man didn't return that week or the next, and slowly, I started to relax, convincing myself it had been a one-off encounter, just a creepy customer with an unsettling vibe. Then came the Friday night, 3 weeks after his first visit. It was a cold night for July, with thick fog settling over the A57, making car headlights look like ghosts floating in the distance. I was alone, as always, cleaning the counter when I heard the familiar crunch of gravel. I looked out the window, expecting a lorry or a passing car, but it was him. Same dark sedan, same tall figure getting out, this time with a hood over his head that partially hid his face. My heart raced, and my hands started sweating as he walked toward the entrance. When he came in, he didn't say anything. He stood in the doorway, the hood casting shadows over his face, and for a moment, I thought it might not be the same man. But then he spoke, and that gravelly voice confirmed it was him. Good evening, Kyle, he said, and the way he said my name made my blood run cold. You look tired. Long night? I'm fine, I said, my voice barely a whisper. What do you want? He walked to the counter, ignoring my question, and leaned against the glass, his hands resting on the edge as if he wanted to climb over. You're a brave kid, working here alone, he said, his tone almost mocking. Most wouldn't last this long. But you've got something special, don't you? I didn't answer. My hand was on the phone, fingers trembling as I dialed 911 without lifting the receiver, hoping he wouldn't notice. But before I could connect the call, he moved fast. Too fast. He came around the counter, something customers never did, and before I could react, he grabbed my arm, his grip like a steel vice. Don't do that, he said, his voice low and dangerous, yanking the phone from my hands and tossing it to the floor. I tried to struggle, but he was much stronger, and in a second, he had me pinned against the wall, his body pressing against mine, his breath hot and sour in my face. "I just want to talk, Kyle. You don't have to make this hard panic hit me like a wave." I tried to shout, but his free hand covered my mouth, muffling the sound. "Shh," he whispered, his face so close I could see the scars on his cheek, small white marks like old cuts. "We don't want to wake the neighbors, do we? What happened next is hard to talk about, even now. I'm ashamed, not because I think I did anything wrong, but because the helplessness I felt still burns." He dragged me to the back room, a small space filled with supply boxes and a dirty sink where no one could see us from the road. I tried to fight, kicked, scratched, but he was too strong, and every move he made was calculated, like he'd done it before. I won't go into details, it's not necessary, but he did things to me no one should endure, things that left me shaking, humiliated, and with a pain that wasn't just physical. The whole time, he talked, his voice low and calm, like he was having a normal conversation, telling me, this is what happens when you're alone at night, that no one's coming to help. It lasted what felt like an eternity, though it was probably minutes. When he was done, he left me crumpled on the backroom floor, my clothes disheveled, tears streaming down my face, and walked out like nothing had happened. I don't know how long I lay there, curled up on the floor, my body aching and my mind blank. Eventually, I crawled to the counter, found the phone, which miraculously hadn't broken, and dialed 911. The operator was kind, but I could barely speak, stammering words between sobs. The police arrived in about 15 minutes, 2 officers who took my statement with serious faces and meticulous notes. They took me to a nearby hospital, where I underwent a medical exam that confirmed what had happened, collecting evidence that made me feel even more exposed. I told them everything I could remember: his leather jacket, his voice, the dark car, the license plate. I couldn't read clearly. They checked the security cameras, but the fog that night had obscured the footage, and the outdoor camera's angle didn't catch his face clearly. They found the car abandoned 2 days later in a Manchester car park, stolen, with no usable fingerprints. The man, whoever he was, seemed to have vanished. I filed a formal report, though every step of the process, talking to detectives, retelling the story, answering questions about details I wanted to forget, was like reliving the trauma. The police did what they could, but without a clear identification or solid evidence beyond my testimony and physical injuries, the case stalled. I never learned anything more about the man, whether they found him or if he went on to hurt others. The petrol station closed for a week while they investigated, and I never went back to work there. I quit the next day, unable to bear the thought of standing behind that counter again, looking out at the car park where it all began. The months that followed were a blur of insomnia and anxiety. I moved to a new flat, far from the A57, but every noise at night, a car passing, a creak on the stairs, made me jump, convinced he was there, watching. The nightmares started almost immediately, dreams where I was trapped in the back room, his voice whispering my name, his hands on me. I'd wake up screaming, soaked in sweat, and sometimes spent hours checking the locks on my door, unable to go back to sleep. My friends noticed the change. I stopped going to the pub, stopped laughing, stopped being the Kyle they knew. My family tried to help, but I couldn't tell them everything. The shame was too great, though I knew it wasn't my fault. I started seeing a psychologist a few weeks later, recommended by the hospital. At first, I went once a week, but the trauma was so deep that I now go 3 times a week, even 10 years later. Therapy has helped me understand that what happened doesn't define me, but it doesn't erase the fear, the sense of vulnerability that settled into me like a broken bone that never fully heals. My therapist says I have post-traumatic stress disorder, something I never thought would affect me. Not me, someone who always considered himself strong, independent. But that night changed me. It made me see the world differently, a place where safety is an illusion, where danger can appear in the form of an ordinary man with a crooked smile. I haven't worked a night shift since. My current job as a delivery driver keeps me moving, away from enclosed spaces, away from being trapped behind a counter. But every time I pass a petrol station at night, especially those on lonely roads, I feel a knot in my stomach. Sometimes I see a dark car in the distance, and my mind plays tricks, making me think it's him. I don't know if they'll ever find him, or if he's still out there, stalking others. What I do know is that I'll never forget his voice, his eyes, the way he said my name, like he already knew me. That's my story, and though I'm ashamed to tell it, I feel I have to, because staying silent is like giving that man power again. If you ever feel too safe at night, remember that the world isn't always kind, and true terror doesn't need ghosts, just people willing to do harm. Stay safe, because I wasn't, and I'm still paying the price.